into 2026, there's obviously been a lot of optimism.
I never want to bet against the resiliency of U.S. large caps.
When you break up the market and see where it's coming from, the bulk of it is coming from big tech.
You have to be very, very careful about how you invest long-term at scale.
You have to be focused on fundamentals at the end of the day.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowicz, and Annmarie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning, good morning. For our audience worldwide, Bloomberg Surveillance starts right now. Coming into Monday, Chair Powell pushing back.
This new threat is not about my testimony last June. It is not about Congress's oversight role. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
Fed Chair Jay Powell insisting Fed independence is under attack, sending U.S. equities down, bond yields higher, the dollar weaker, and helping to push precious metals to fresh all-time highs. The Fed chair is standing firm.
The Fed chair coming out announcing this. Who knows when he actually got these subpoenas, announcing these and saying, guess what? This has nothing to do with the renovations. This has everything to do with increasing pressure by this president, by this administration on the Federal Reserve's independence, for us standing up for the American people. Look, whatever your goals are, if President Trump's goal is getting interest rates on the long end lower, this is failing because long end interest rates are rising, the dollar is weakening, and frankly, you're seeing this sort of reversal to the flight of America trade. So the question is, who's behind this and what's the ultimate motivation?
We'll get into that a little bit later, but Lisa, you've got to think about what's new. Attacks on this institution, not new. What's new is that response from Chairman Powell over the weekend, and this quote should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. The chairman calling the administration out pretty clearly.
Absolutely, pretty clearly, with a rare video message alongside a statement. And to Lisa's point, this might have unintended consequences of what the president wants in terms of interest rates. Also, whether or not Jay Powell actually steps aside. Yes, we know his chair ends May 15th this year, but he is still a governor until the end of January 31st, 2028. And potentially what this does is maybe makes him want to stay on the Federal Reserve a little bit longer.
And it might make life a little bit harder to appoint a new Fed chair. This from Senator Tillis, the Republican, by the way. Here's the quote: I will oppose the confirmation of any nominee for the Fed, including the upcoming Fed chair vacancy, until this legal matter is fully resolved.
And he is on the Senate Banking Committee, and right now it is 13 Republicans to 11 Democrats. If Tom Tillis does defect to the Democratic side, or there is unified agreement on not getting through any additional Fed nominees until this issue is resolved, well, guess what? You have a hamstrung administration trying to get new nominees through it. By the way, why haven't we got a new nominee? If you want to make Fed Chair Jay Powell a lame duck Fed chair, why not have somebody else waiting in the wings?
Tom Tillis could be an individual that completely blocks Trump's next Fed nominee. And then once again, you have the chair, Jay Powell, staying on the board longer than his chairmanship ends. So this could potentially be very much so a drawn-out process for this administration.
Look, I look at this and I just think unintended consequences. Go to the price action. Let's not freak out about this. Sure, equities are down, bonds down, yields are up only a little bit, dollar's only a touch weaker as well. Directionally, I get it, the Sell America stuff that people are worried about, but the scale of the move, pretty muted. Why? The unintended consequences of all of this is just the view. Inflation expectations have been really anchored in this bond market for the last 12 months, even under the pressure coming from the White House towards the Federal Reserve. Why? That view is out that this will just galvanize other people on the committee and make it very, very hard for anyone coming in to get the lower interest rates the president desires.
If this is an attack on the Federal Reserve, it is not a well-oiled attack on the Federal Reserve that people think will be effective in actually getting the Fed to disproportionately lower interest rates based on economic fundamentals. And that is what the market seems to be implying.
We've got a lot to get through. Now, I thought I'd wake up this morning and talk about credit card stocks. So,
you can get there.
Spent a lot of Saturday morning looking at that story.
The day is young.
Here we are Monday. If you want to check out credit card stocks, check them out in the pre-market, getting absolutely hammered as the president considers, or at least wants to, is trying to take steps to cap interest rates at 10% for 12 months?
Yeah.
And this is what's happening in the pre-market.
Yeah, 10% versus the 25 to 30% interest rates. Of course, his authority to do so, a real question here. But guess what? If someone wants to appeal to affordability, they attack banks. If you want to be a populist candidate, whether it's Bernie Sanders or President Trump, you attack banks. We are about to get bank earnings. They're going to probably be pretty good. And let me think, even if it isn't this, it'll be something else once those results come out.
I am a little bit surprised about the market move for this. The president on Air Force One last night said that they need to start following the law by January 20th. Well, he only put out a Truth Social post, but it is not law yet that you are capping interest rates at 10%. There is a bill circulating in Congress when it comes to the Senate, and it was introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley. It is a populist message, as Lisa said, and you are going to continuously hear these populist messages as 2026 really starts to feel like 2024 and we're back on the campaign trail.
Capital One down by 10% in the pre-market so far. We'll get you more on that story a little bit later this hour. Coming up this hour, Steve Chevron of Federated with stocks pulling back from all-time highs. Tobin Marcus of Wolfe Research as the Fed has served subpoenas from the Justice Department. And Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Asset Management as the Sal America trade returns. We begin this hour with our top story. The DOJ serving subpoenas to the Federal Reserve.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
Fed Chair Jay Powell vowing to serve out his full term despite the threats. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Mike McKee. Mike, a new front for this battle.
Oh, absolutely. And this is extraordinary. Not just what the administration is doing, but the fact that the Fed went this far in responding to it. They normally try to keep their heads down and stay out of politics. But here you have the Fed chair accusing the president of the United States, basically, of extortion. Now, it's important to realize this is not an indictment yet. This is just a subpoena for documents from the D.C. U.S. Attorney, Jeanine Pirro, demanding the documents related to the Fed's renovations of two of its buildings. Now, the president has been stymied in his effort to fire Powell, but the Supreme Court takes that up later this month. So we don't know where all this is going to go from here. The president last night denied involvement to NBC, saying, I don't know anything about it, but he's certainly not very good at the Fed, and he's not very good at building buildings. We'll see where the Fed and the markets go from here. Markets not really changing their view of a January move, only a 4% chance, and that went away sort of after the jobs report on Friday. But it is interesting, as you guys were talking about, to consider what would happen with the effort to put in a new Fed chair. Senator Tillis's decision to vote against anybody until something happens to resolve this makes it impossible to get anybody out of the banking committee, since there's a 13-11 split between Republicans and Democrats, and one Republican defection makes it a tie vote, and the nomination sits in the banking committee. So it's not clear what the administration is going to get out of this, except it may be an effort to pressure Jay Powell to resign as a governor once his term as chairman is over.
Mike McKee, stay close. I think we're in for a long morning. Here's the view on Wall Street this morning. Steve Chevron of Federated Hermes writing the following. Readers of this note should be skeptical that a market already up 83% since the end of 22 could possibly enjoy yet another double-digit return. Surprise, surprise. We think it's going to be another good one. Steve joins us now for more. Steve, good morning. I assume you didn't write that last night.
No, I thought we were going to have a very different discussion when I left.
Is this going to be another good one with everything in mind?
Look, I mean, I think the story is, and what we were writing about, and we're trying to identify surprises, ironically, for 2026 when we were writing about it, is that there really is a good economic setup, whether it's continued AI capex, upside surprises to employment that we see, kind of tailwinds for the consumer that are starting to emerge, earnings estimates that continue to rise. But, as the great philosopher Mike Tyson once said, have a plan until you get punched in the nose.
Well, let's talk about the punch in the face we got overnight. So, look, the chairman's come out, stood his ground. This Federal Reserve has been under attack for much of the last 12 months, and the market has barely blinked. Is there any reason for the market to blink now?
We'll see. Look, I've sat around this table with you for, the last 10 years, and most of the time when you have a political upheaval like this, being patient has been rewarded, and that's kind of our brand. I mean, and I think that's probably a good default position. However, I mean, it almost doesn't matter how you got to the message last night. I mean, take both sides potentially. If you have a Federal Reserve chair engaging in criminal activity, that's really not good. If you have a president using political pretext to indict a Fed chair, that's not good. That message being released is certainly not one that argues for Fed independence. There's really no argument that says this leads to lower rates, which is what I think everybody probably wants to see happen. It offsets the positive, which was mortgage rates coming down last week, which I thought was hugely positive, coming below 6%. And I think this complicates the job for whoever the next Fed chair is, which was already going to be somewhat complicated in terms of expressing independence. This just makes it a little bit harder. So, my hope, not just as a market participant, but as an American, is that we lower the temperature on this, and this ends up being a kerfluffle. But the longer it goes on, the harder it is for that to happen.
You said that the market likes to look past some of these policy crosswinds that keep emerging, and yet it seems like the market is counting on the ones that are good for it and dismissing the ones that are bad for it. It seems like a lot of the positive views are based on fiscal and monetary stimulus, and any of the negative views around some of the concerns there are sort of dismissed. Do you think that that's valid?
I don't know that that's 100% fair. I mean, there were a lot of concerns around tariffs, right, that just didn't actually materialize in the data. So, I mean, I think the reason why the market has done that is, generally speaking, a lot of the news flow or the announcements that have been market unfriendly have ultimately proven to be negotiating ploys, right? You're going to do drug pricing, you're going to institute it, and then that leads to a kind of negotiation with Pfizer that ends up being okay. So I think the market has some patience with the president's negotiating style. I think you might ultimately see that hold true on some of the things that are going on with the credit card companies right now. But the Fed thing does feel a little bit different because, again, you run the risk of going to a point of no return and making it harder to kind of pull back from that. Maybe last night's video was that. We'll see.
When you say that you think that this time could be somewhat different when it comes to the credit card companies,
I think it'll be similar to what happened with Pfizer.
You do think it will be similar to what happened. Do you think that in general the bank's outperformance is challenged by the idea that they're going to be on the hot seat when they're reporting big earnings at a time when there's a huge populist upswing?
Yeah, I think clearly the 2026 battle lines are being drawn, and it's going to be a midterm election on affordability, and it's going to be a race to populism. And I think that that's going to cause some heartburn for certain companies based on the news flow. I think what you see with the credit card companies, the same thing that happened with the drug companies, when you get these kinds of announcements, it's both a threat, with the president saying this really is bothering me. It's also an invitation to negotiate. And if you can do that constructively, like the healthcare companies did, you end up with something that you can live with and helps consumers a bit. I think that kind of announcement, in my mind, fits into that frame. I don't really know what the Fed can do to kind of lower the temperature on this. We may have kind of hit the point of no return there.
Well, do you think the chances of Jay Powell staying on to serve out his full term as governor until 2028, those chances have increased overnight?
I mean, it sure seems that way. I mean, you can't deliver that. I mean, you cannot deliver that message that directly and then say, well, my term as chair is done, I'm going to step away. I don't know how you do that. I mean, if you are really that concerned about the institution, and let's be clear. I mean, I've been critical of the chair quite a bit on this show over the years. I think he's helped us get to this point. I mean, I think Trump deserves all of the responsibility for what's happened yesterday as well. But they've both, I think, acted in ways that have undermined this institution over the course of the last several years. And I don't know how you can make that claim and then walk away. So I would assume that those odds are higher.
Steve, out of interest, what do you think the chairman's done to undermine the institution?
I think that there were certain optics of things that could have been done better. I don't think that you can not hike rates for a year in 2021 when inflation is raising and then hike the first time after you're renominated and then move to 75 basis points after you're reconfirmed. I don't think he did it for political purposes. I wouldn't cast that aspersion on the Fed. I just think that when you're managing an institution like that, optics really matter. And when you open up that box, it's not helpful. And so I think there's been little things like that. I'm not saying that he deserves any of this. I have no idea if he does or he doesn't. But I am saying that the relationship between the White House and the Federal Reserve, I think over the last two administrations, has been managed in a way that's not great for the institution.
Steve, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for dropping by. Thank you. Steve Chevron there of Federated. A messy start to a new trading week, only a week or two into a new year. Equity futures on the S&P down by about 0.6%. With an update on stories worldwide with your Bloomberg Brief, here's Yahira. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, John. Federal Housing Director Bill Pulte is a driving force behind the Trump administration's subpoena of the Federal Reserve. Sources telling us here at Bloomberg, Pulte is responsible for intensifying pressure on Chair Powell as President Trump prepares to announce his pick for a new Fed chair. Bill Pulte will join surveillance at 7:30 a.m. Eastern this morning. Meanwhile, shares of major credit card issuers are falling in the pre-market. President Donald Trump demanding they cap interest rates at 10% for 1 year. Trump saying if they do not lower them by January 20th, they are violating the law. His demand was not backed up by legislation, and he provided no explanation for how the lenders would be breaking the law. And Iran warning the U.S. and Israel against any intervention as protests in the country enter their third week. President Trump saying he is closely monitoring the protests and considering potential military options. Activists say that at least 540 people have been killed in Iran so far. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Yahara, thank you. Thanks for the update. Up next on the program, Chair Powell standing firm.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
A conversation up next with Tobin Marcus of Wolf Research, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. From New York City, welcome to the program. Equities down, clear underperformance worldwide right now in the United States. Equities are down by 0.6% on S&P 500 futures, down by 0.8 on the Nasdaq. In the bond market, 2s, 10s, 30s, you'll just sit the long end of the curve. Yields bleeding a bit higher, up by 4 basis points on 30s to 485. On 10s, up by 2. Still range bound, we should stress that, but up by 2 basis points to 419.10 on a 10-year maturity. And the surveillance this morning, our main story, Chair Powell standing firm.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do.
So here's the latest this morning. Tensions between the Fed and the White House soaring to new heights after the DOJ threatens the central bank with a criminal indictment. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us now from Washington with the latest. Tyler, that is quite a move overnight.
Hey, John, good morning. It is a major escalation against Fed Chair Jerome Powell as he pushes back against what is considered to be unprecedented action. Now, people familiar with the matter tell us here at Bloomberg News that FHFA Director Bill Pulte was a driving force behind these subpoenas, and it is our understanding that the U.S. Attorney General for D.C., Jeanine Pirro, greenlit this investigation. She is considered to be a longtime ally of this White House. Now, in an interview with NBC News, President Trump denied having knowledge of this investigation beforehand, but he, of course, has long threatened Powell and the central bank, which, as you've been discussing, has been at the center of Powell's defense against these allegations. The investigation centers on accusations that Powell misled Congress in June testimony about renovations to the Fed's headquarters here in Washington. These are allegations that Powell denies, though budget documents do show that the Fed did see cost overruns last year, reaching $2.5 billion compared to estimates of $1.9 billion in 2019. Powell has said that those cost overruns were standard and they were factored in because of what were rising costs and ultimately plans going having to shift due to how the renovations were ultimately going. But it's important to point out there, we just showed President Trump with Jerome Powell touring those renovations. At the time, President Trump said that he didn't think that cost overruns actually amounted to a fireable offense because there is a very high legal bar here to remove a Federal Reserve official. And that is why this investigation focusing on Congress is going to be so important to the DOJ advancing their own case. But John, as you've discussed earlier on this program, Congress could also stymie these efforts after we heard from Senator Tom Tillis that he could block any Federal Reserve nominees. I will point out that Tom Tillis is retiring.
Tyler Kendall with the latest down in Washington. Tyler, thank you. Joining us now to extend the conversation, Tobin Marcus of Wolf Research. Tobin, this was new. The chairman has really resisted engaging on this topic for the last 12 months. He could not have been any clearer about his personal thoughts overnight. How does this change the story?
It makes sense that it changed the way that the Fed is reacting. The direct threat of criminal prosecution, I think it's very understandable that Chair Powell will be reacting in a different way. But in terms of the setup for financial markets going forward, I don't know that this adds to the credibility of the threats against the Fed. The idea that DOJ would actually be able to make a criminal case seems very unlikely to me. We're already seeing the backlash from the Senate. Tyler mentioned Senator Tillis. Like, he is in a unique position to exercise this threat as a retiring member. It's a credible threat given his ability to deadlock the Banking Committee. So, that's a problem, I think, in terms of the likelihood that Chair Powell decides to stay on. That's also a problem. So it's kind of counterproductive on its face, which I think is going to help mute the reaction in financial markets today.
Is the bar now higher for Trump's Fed nominee pick, given what we heard from Senator Tillis?
Well, I think that nothing that we see from the nominee within the four walls of the nomination, I think, is going to change Tillis's mind. Tillis seems appropriately, in my mind, to be concerned about the sort of state of the institution and the way that it's being approached overall. We've always expected that President Trump was going to pick someone he believed was going to be dependably loyal for the next Fed chair. I still think that's true. That's always inclined me personally towards Hassett within the consideration set, but we'll see what he does.
But I'm just wondering if someone like Governor Waller this morning wakes up with a much better chance to be the next Fed chair.
I mean, look, like, the set of considerations within the White House that led to the actions to which Powell is reacting, I think, is also going to steer them towards someone like Hassett over someone like Waller. If the president had a mindset that was going to steer him towards Waller, who I think would be a good pick, I think that's sort of certainly, if you give truth serum to market participants, that who they overwhelmingly would choose among this consideration set, like, precisely because Trump is apprehensive about Waller. That's the same kind of thinking that's leading him to continue escalating pressure on Powell.
Tobin, how do you understand the past week, I guess, is a way to ask, because we've seen so many different headlines and policy pronouncements coming out of the White House, from credit card fees to what has really been mounting pressure on the Fed chair, to Venezuela, to Iran. Why so much to start the year?
Yeah, don't forget single-family rentals. Don't forget the restrictions on capital return for defense companies.
That's also
$1.4 billion defense budget. Yeah, I mean, look, like, obviously we're going into a midterm year. Clearly, the president is at one level, I think, searching for a set of policies and a message around those policies that's going to try and defy the historical trend for the president's party to lose the House. He's talked explicitly about not wanting to get impeached again. I think that is something that House Democrats may find themselves very tempted to do if they win. So, that's the biggest driver. But he's also just been very, very active. I think anytime he sees something that there's any possibility of getting policy traction on, in Trump 2.0, even more so than Trump 1.0, he wants to push the limits of what his authorities are. He wants to show that pace of activity. People in the administration love to talk about Trump speed. They put out more executive orders during the first term than anyone in 100 years. So, yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of churn and activity. And the question for markets in a lot of cases is going to be, can they actually do these things that they're floating? So with the credit card announcement today, I think the answer most likely is no. And so some of the price moves will probably prove to be a little bit short-lived.
Tobin, appreciate your take. As always, Tobin Marcus there of Wolf Research. Just to pick up on that last point, let's say the president could achieve this, cap interest rates at 10%. The great irony of all of this is that could have a chilling effect on credit availability and spending in this country, and the consequences may well feel like a rate hike. Same story with the pressure that's building on the Federal Reserve. To your point, Lisa, at the top of the hour, the consequences could well be higher interest rates, which could well be the complete opposite of what the president and this White House wants.
I mean, ultimately, what you're seeing right now on the margins is implied higher mortgage rates on the heels of what happened with respect to the subpoena sent to the Fed chair. When it comes to credit cards, a lot of people are talking about how any kind of proposal to cap interest rates emboldens buy now, pay later, which has significantly higher interest rates than even these banks. So exactly to your point, it is the right one.
These ideas are typically ideas that come from the financially illiterate left. And you're seeing much more of it from the Republican Party. And you should call it out for what it is, just bad ideas.
This is a circle. Populism uniting on one end, and that's what we see right now.
If you're just joining us, welcome to the program. Equities down by just 0.6%. All-time highs coming into a brand new trading week. Equities on the S&P 500 pulling back from those record highs this morning. We're down by 0.6% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, we're down by 0.85. On the Russell, negative by 0.3. If we switch at the board and get to the bond market, 2s, 10s, 30s shaping up as follows. Now, we can talk about direction and then we can talk about scale. Let's just sit on direction. Yields are up by 3 basis points. It's a best steepener. 30s are up by 4. The 2 years anchored. It speaks to maybe some concern about Fed independence. I get it. But when you think about scale, these aren't big moves, Lisa. I understand the concern, but these aren't big moves this morning.
A lot of people think that this doesn't actually mean that the Fed chair is going to be forcibly removed. And if anything, some people are speculating it could make him even stay on the Fed as a Fed governor even after his term as Fed chair is up. The bigger picture, though, might be a warning. And I think this is what people are picking up on and maybe exacerbating if they want to get in on the trade. That sort of this would be the knee-jerk reaction to a feeling of some sort of loss of Fed independence. Whether or not this is extreme, no, it is not an extreme move. But this is the direction of travel should this become a more feasible proposal.
If this was achievable, if it happened, if the Fed chair got sacked and someone came in and took control and dropped rates aggressively, I think they'd buy bonds too. I'd be much more concerned about what's going to happen in FX. And you get a little sprinkle of that this morning too. Precious metals, all-time highs, gold, silver, dollar weaker against everything in G10, euro positive by 0.4%. Again, the move is small, but directionally this morning it all speaks to the same thing, concern about what took place overnight. As we count you down to the open in about 3 hours from the cash open, let's get you some morning moves with Danny. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. There's some real concern when it comes to these credit card companies. This started after the close on Friday when President Trump said that he wanted credit card companies or was calling for them to cap interest rates at 10%. It's not clear how and what mechanism he can do that, but on Sunday he reiterated that call, saying that these companies would be in violation of the law if they didn't make those changes by January 20th for 1 year. American Express down 4%, Capital One getting hammered down nearly 10%, JP Morgan down nearly 3%, Citi, all those other credit card companies also getting hurt. By the way, Klarna and all the buy now, pay later companies, those are surging at the pre-market. Elsewhere, where Walmart having a positive start to its week, shares are up just under 4% in the pre-market. Two things going on. For one, the Nasdaq announcing that Walmart will be joining the Nasdaq 100. Jefferies says that will add $19 billion flowing into Walmart stock given its inclusion in passive indices. They've also announced a partnership with Alphabet that you will be able to shop on Walmart via the Gemini chat assistant. They already have a partnership with ChatGPT. Finally, just rounding up another company moving on the president's words. President Trump saying that he would be inclined to exclude Exxon from any rebuild of Venezuela's oil infrastructure, saying he didn't like the response of the CEO, Darren Woods, calling it cute. The CEO, for his part, during that roundtable with oil executives, called Venezuela uninvestable. So those shares down about 1 1/3% here at the pre-market, John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. I think it's easy to explain the difference in tone coming from Chevron and Exxon on Friday into the weekend. One's in Venezuela and the other's not, and clearly doesn't want to be at this point.
One has been in Venezuela for 100 years, and it's probably why Secretary Marco Rubio sent Trump a note and then Trump read it out loud saying, go back to Chevron, because they have actual on-the-ground intel about Venezuela, and they can easily add more to the production. ExxonMobil got burned twice.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Why are they going to go back in?
This is my point. If you have a longer-term view, regardless of who the president is, and you've had your money seized, billions of dollars twice in the past couple of decades, I mean, really? Is that something that is cute to just say, I don't know?
And ConocoPhillips, the president said, we're starting on a clean slate when it comes to going back in, although they are still owed $12 billion.
That story, that news conference feels like a lifetime ago, by the way. A lot's changed over the weekend. On our radar this morning, the Federal Reserve receiving a subpoena from the Department of Justice, threatening to indict Chairman Powell over his testimony on headquarter renovations. Powell saying the threat is retaliation for keeping rates too high. President Donald Trump saying the U.S. needs to own Greenland. The president saying if the U.S. does not take it, Russia or China will. The president adding he's willing to secure the territory, quote, the hard way if authorities are unwilling to cut a deal. And finally, shares of credit card firms sinking in pre-market trading as President Trump demands lenders cap interest rates at 10% for 1 year. Trump adding the companies will be in violation of the law if they do not comply by his January 20th deadline.
Look, there are a lot of questions about how feasible it is for him to actually enact this as policy. In fact, many people say it's not going to happen. Nonetheless, this does heighten the bar heading into earnings season. Just think about how some of these banks are going to come out and talk about huge profits in the face of this popular upswing against them. Because guess what? When everybody wants to talk about affordability, who's the easy boogeyman? Well, guess what? It is the big banks, especially when they're making big money.
So the President of the United States addresses the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, a week on Wednesday. Wednesday, and I imagine this story might be coming up. And I think that event could be a market-moving event just next week.
Absolutely, and I wonder who's going to be helping him with his speech. At this point, it looks like it's going to be Senator Bernie Sanders, an individual who introduced this bill nearly a year ago, capping credit card interest rates by 10%. And you know who tweeted about 5 hours before Trump decided for that Truth Social post? Bernie Sanders. Trump promised to cap credit card interest rates at 10% and stop Wall Street from getting away with murder. Instead, he deregulated the banks, going after Trump for a 2024 election campaign promise. Claudia Sam put it so well over the weekend. Move over, taco. It's Big Mac. Midterms are coming time.
Look, if you look at the moves we're seeing this morning, to build on what Danny said, if you're making buy now, pay later great again, there's a bit of a problem with the policy you're introducing.
Well, that means that interest rates are going to be that much higher. And frankly, these are going to be that much more punitive in terms of the loans that people take out. What these policies actually effectuate are completely different than what they're prescribing to do, which is the reason why they have been tried before and they fail every single time. Whether or not this is going to be the same kind of thing, and yes, midterms are coming, but maybe won't be fulfilled on some of these promises, or whether this is actually going to gain traction remains to be seen.
If you can't price risk appropriately, you'll just take less. That's ultimately the story with the credit card companies. If you can't price risk appropriately, if you can't put the right number on things, you'll just take less. And that's what's going to happen. Ultimately, if you go forward with this, and obviously no one really thinks this is going to happen this morning, but if you did, that's what would happen.
We talk about how the average FICO score at the likes of Bank of America and JP Morgan is above 700. We talk about how there are an increasing number of people who are unbanked or underbanked. Guess why? Because increasingly, especially with new regulations post the financial crisis, these banks didn't want to take that risk. And so it left a lot of people out of the banking system. Pick your poison. Do you want more people to be banked, or do you want to regulate the level of some of these interest rates?
The earnings calls are going to be interesting, aren't they?
Fascinating.
Next couple of days. Can you talk to us about the credit card profits you made?
Let me tell you about the Bank of America great again.
Something like that.
I invested a lot.
Let's turn to the Middle East. Iranian officials saying they've secured full control over the country after mass protests led to 2 weeks of upheaval and hundreds reported killed. President Trump set for a key briefing on potential U.S. involvement as soon as tomorrow. Joining us now is former senior U.S. intelligence official Norman Rule. Norman, welcome to the programme, sir. We've seen this in this country many times over the last 10 years. This felt different over the last week. How different is it?
It's quite different. And good morning. The current nationwide protests in Iran continue to have reached a scale and intensity that is unprecedented in the history of the Islamic Republic. Virtually every major city and town is experiencing some form of political protest against the government, calling for regime change, not just complaints against a specific economic policy. And what you have is the tactical government efforts to contain these protests through promises of economic reform have not satisfied the protesters, and increasingly coercive and violent responses by the government have not ended the protests thus far. And the result is that we've seen deaths. We've seen hundreds of protester deaths. We've seen as many as 40 to 50 to 100 security force personnel be killed. And we've seen thousands of arrests. So we're watching a very intensive, turbulent situation in Iran.
Norm, absolutely horrific, these images coming out of Iran. What makes this protest, though, different than prior protests we saw?
We're watching basically a very compressed situation. So in the 2022 to 2023 situation, for example, the number of the tragic number of deaths, for example, that took place over a much longer period of time. The number of arrests took place over a much longer period of time. So we're watching a compression of this. And this is happening because the inflation, the collapse of the currency, the disillusion with the government, the failed policy, the oppression, it's built upon itself since 2017. So you've got an extraordinarily unhappy population that feels the government, correctly so, feeling that the government is just unable to deliver. And at the same time, you have a government that is broken. It's trying to satisfy a military that's taking a large portion of the budget, missiles, regional militias, a nuclear program that's brought sanctions upon the government, while at the same time trying to promise economic relief to a population. And in the end, it can't deliver. And just the currency problem alone is extraordinary. So when at the time of the nuclear deal, the Iranian rial was 29,500 to the dollar. When the recently fired, central bank governor took office, it was about 920,000 to the dollar. In December, when the protests began, it was 1.42 million to the dollar. There's no reason to believe that this collapse will not continue further because the government is broken.
Norman, overnight, Iran's foreign ministry said that there is a communication channel between their foreign minister and Mr. Witkoff now open. The president told reporters that the Iranian leaders have reached out. He also went on to say a meeting is being set up, but we may have to act because of what's happening before the meeting. How should we read the president's comments?
Seriously. So let's take a look first at what is the likelihood that the president will conduct a military strike. If you look at U.S. Behavior and the president's actions, there is a high likelihood of a military strike. The president has conducted surgical, limited military action following a series of social media statements, a series of promises of action if specific behavior was not undertaken, diplomatic outreach, and military moves. A lot of this has happened thus far, and the social media and the intensity of the president's social media statements have increased. We've seen a visit of the Omani foreign minister to Iran, which looked like a message one way or the other. Now, we have the Iranian outreach. So why is that happening? Well, that offers the Iranians several advantages. First, gives them a chance to tell their own population, maybe sanctions are being lifted. So that might break the unrest. Unlikely. But it also might allow test the United States, delay the United States attack. I don't think that's going to buy them much patience with the president.
Norm, what could the U.S. do with respect to military strikes that would be effective? I mean, how risky is this at a time where already there is an incredibly explosive feeling in the region and previous incursions have led to mixed results?
Frankly, I think it'd be unwise to give a lot of detail because the Iranians are going to be interested in that question as well. But U.S. military power is vast. The Iranians have no capability to really defend against it, as we've seen in June. The press reports have talked about aerial attacks. Other tools are available, and the Iranians are very susceptible to this. The U.S. has the means to deliver an extraordinary punishing blow against those units and personnel that would be involved in violence against protesters. And that's what the president has talked about, responding to those who have committed violence and against peaceful protesters, deaths against peaceful protesters. And we've seen an extraordinary number of deaths in the last weekend.
Norman, we already have Venezuela with questions around who's going to lead it. If there is some sort of strike that does imperil the Iranian leadership, do we have a sense of who is going to take over and how intimately involved the U.S. will be with that?
I've been working the Middle East and other issues too long to make predictions on who will lead governments in the future, predicting elections. The Iranian people will no doubt choose their own leadership. I would say that there is a deep Revolutionary Guard network within the country, in corporations and all aspects of the leadership. If you were to draw upon the existing system of society of who might follow, if the existing system remains in place, it's probably going to be drawn from that DNA. And that's the sort of DNA that would likely be willing to engage with the West and with the region in an assertive manner, protecting Iranian equities, but it would engage with the West.
Norm, appreciate your take and your insight as always. Thank you, sir. The former senior US intelligence official, Norman Rule, and a key story on the international stage. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Back with us, here's Yahara. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. The Supreme Court says it will release its next round of decisions this Wednesday. Markets are awaiting a ruling on President Trump's April 2nd Liberation Day tariffs. The court doesn't say in advance which decisions are ready for release, only that rulings in argued cases are possible. Meanwhile, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says hundreds more federal agents are being deployed to Minneapolis. The announcement comes as thousands marched in the city this weekend after a federal agent shot and killed a woman during a confrontation last Wednesday. The national debate is raging over whether the use of deadly force was justified. And Bob Weir, a founding member and guitarist with the Grateful Dead, has died at the age of 78. Weir was also a contributing writer to key songs like Playing in the Band and Sugar Magnolia. According to a family statement, Weir succumbed to underlying lung issues after being diagnosed with cancer in July. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Yahara, thank you. Thanks for the update. Up next on the program, turning up the heat on the Federal Reserve.
When people are concerned about Fed independence, when they're concerned the Fed is going to take a structurally more dovish view of the economy because of this political pressure, they're also seeing it reflected in long-term yields going up.
That conversation up next with Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan from New York City. You're watching Bloomberg TV. It's a flavour of things this morning. So stocks are lower, down by 0.6% compared to the rest of the world. Some clear underperformance stateside this morning. On the Nasdaq, we're down by 0.9. In the bond market, this is the bleed you're seeing at the long end of the curve. Yields up on 10s, on 30s by 3 to 4 basis points, up to 419.69. Out of surveillance this morning, turning up the heat on the Federal Reserve.
When people are concerned about Fed independence, when they're concerned the Fed is going to take a structurally more dovish view of the economy, not just in the short term, in the long term, because of this political pressure. People get worried about long-term inflation. They're also seeing it reflected in long-term yields going up relative to short-term yields.
So here's the latest this morning. Bond yields pushing higher after the DOJ subpoenaed the Federal Reserve. Worries about the central bank's independence reigniting the so-called Sell America trade. Joining us now to discuss is Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Asset Management. Kelsey, good morning.
Good morning.
Story's not new. In the last year, bonds actually had a decent year, even against that backdrop. Is there anything new about what took place over the weekend that changes the direction of travel for treasuries?
Well, certainly what happened overnight is a bit of an escalation, and we certainly are in a bit of a difficult situation. And what I view this as is as a test of the Fed's institutional credibility, is a test of that framework. But at the same time, you know, I look at what happened so far this year. Typically, when you start the new year, bonds start with big issuance. You know, that's what we start with. We start with investment grade credit, emerging market debt, all issuing a lot of bonds. They did that last week. They did that with fairly robust demand coming into the market. So you had emerging market debt, largest week of issuance so far in the first week of the year. And those books were 2 to 6 times oversubscribed. So the market came in looking to buy bonds, right? There was appetite there. And up until last night, I think the biggest development for the bond market was actually the announcement of the $200 billion potential buying of agency mortgage-backed securities. And so now it's this complicated situation because on Friday you saw a 25 basis point approximately move lower in mortgage rates, which is a really good thing for home affordability. And now you have long end yields, which are rising, which may undo some of that progress.
Up until last night, we had a range-bound bond market. Anything about the news of the last 24 hours that shakes us out of that range?
I mean, so far, no. It's really amazing. You look at the 10-year yield, and since the middle of December, the range is less than 10 basis points. So we're between 411 and 420. And I think when you think about that range, it comes down to fundamentals. And I know fundamentals, they really feel like they're taking a back seat today to the discussions about geopolitical risk and the credit card caps, all of these things. But when I look at the fundamentals, I see 3 key things. One is that growth has been resilient. 2, the labor market has been shaky, and that's kept the Fed's easing bias. And 3, and I think most importantly, number 3, is inflation expectations have remained very benign. And that's why in the first week of the year, as you had record bond issuance, you saw a lot of demand come in because long and real yields are elevated. There is a fair bit of term premium already priced into the market, and long-term inflation expectations remain fairly benign.
At a certain point, I think John nailed it earlier when he said it's not necessarily going to be bond yields that feel the effects of a real question to Fed independence. It's going to be the dollar. Because ultimately, if the Fed's not independent, they can buy all the bonds they want and they can drive lower end yields lower. And that is actually a pretty controlled element. Is it just a matter of where you want to buy bonds based on currency differentials?
So I think the dollar is one of the release valves, at least in the short term, to reflect the concerns around Fed independence. The other one, of course, is gold. So we had a realistic surprise target for gold prices for this year of $5,000 an ounce. And that, I mean, to me now seems potentially too low. The amount of appreciation that you've seen in the metals is truly incredible. Now, some of that appreciation is not just a demand story, but also a supply story. So when you talk about the Treasury market, that's the deepest, most liquid market in the world. It prices everything very efficiently. In the metals market, you need to not only disentangle the signal from a fundamental perspective, but also the fact that these are much smaller markets, much more easily influenced by the technicals. But I think in general, it makes sense to me that you are seeing a modestly weaker dollar and and higher gold prices. And I think really what I would be watching are some of these comments that you've been getting for Republicans around the process of the Fed chair confirmation. And if this escalation in this investigation around Powell and the Fed somehow slows that down and makes that more challenging. Because really, I see the Senate confirmation process as one of the biggest institutional guardrails that protects the Fed's independence, particularly in the near term here.
In the meantime, you talk about all the issuance to start the year. At what point is there a crowding out based on some of the big tech issuance and elsewhere that's going to cause yields to grind higher globally?
I don't think you've seen that crowding out, particularly when I look at the demand for those books. I mentioned 2 to 6 times oversubscribed in EM markets, for example, the debt that they're issuing. If they look in investment grade credit, particularly so far, we haven't had a lot of tech issuance. It's mainly been focused in financials. But what we've been seeing there is that deals have been able to get done with fairly limited concessions. And so, you know, so far, so good from that perspective. The other thing that I would highlight, I've been talking to our mortgage analysts about this move tighter in mortgage spreads and how much further that can go. And recognizing that for price-sensitive buyers, spreads are getting pretty darn tight. But we've now introduced a price-insensitive buyer potentially into the mix. And the other thing that I would highlight is that typically flows follow returns. Last year, mortgage funds, mortgages in general, had returns that rivaled U.S. high yield. So the mortgage index, the Bloomberg mortgage index, up around 8.5%. That was the same as U.S. high yield. People are going to see that, and it's likely that additional flows are going to follow.
Stepping into the Federal Reserve's realm of influence. I actually thought the MBS announcement had more consequences for this so-called independence conversation than anything that's been announced over the last 12 months.
Yeah, it does. The Fed get on board, especially because they've been allowing some of these bond holdings to run off.
Kelsey, good to see you. Thanks for dropping by. Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Asset Management. Things can change. That's the lesson of 2026 so far. They can change in 5 minutes. It's a year that's moving at 200 miles an hour. Up next on the program, Russ Brownback of BlackRock, Henrietta Trey's of Veda Partners, the Federal Housing Finance Director, Bill Palti, and Nouriel Roubini.
The economy is largely fine. The tailwinds are stacked.
We're still watching some of this macro weakness.
We actually think the economy is in a very good place.
This just doesn't look like the typical business cycle.
If, you see this broadening in consumption, that can kind of be the new story in 2026.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowicz, and Annmarie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning, good morning. For our audience worldwide, the second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance starts right now, and your scores look like this. Pulling back from all-time highs on the S&P 500, following a 2-day winning streak going into the weekend. We're down by 0.6% this Monday morning. On the Nasdaq, we're down by 0.8. A lot of you turning to the bond market. Let's do the same. Switch at the board. In fixed income, 2s, 10s, 30s. The focus at the long end of the curve where yields are bleeding higher, up by 3 basis points on 10s, up by 4 to 5 on 30s, with central bank independence very much in focus.
Because Fed Chair Jay Powell is putting it in focus. Let's be clear. He said he reported that the Federal Reserve received a subpoena, a sort of a charge over what happened with respect to his testimony regarding the renovations of 2 buildings. He said that the threat of criminal consequence here has nothing to do with his testimony or the renovations. He says it has to do with their policy of setting interest rates. He then went on to say this: public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do with the integrity of and commitment to serving the American people. Does this indicate a potential digging in of the heels that could go longer than his Fed chairmanship?
Which is why everyone is saying, and Neil Dutta last night immediately on Twitter is saying the odds of Powell sticking around to serve out his term as governor, not chair, which is up in a few months, as governor, have increased. And he's up for governor the end of January of 2028. Key right now is everyone's focus on the Senate Banking Committee. Senior member of that committee, Senator Thom Tillis, came out swiftly within moments saying, I will oppose the confirmation of any nominee for the Fed, including the upcoming Fed chair vacancy, until this legal matter is fully resolved. So these are a lot of unintended consequences for this administration.
If you believe last night was the end of central bank independence, this is not the market you'd expect to see Monday morning. Yes, directionally, we're seeing equities down, the dollar weaker and bond yields higher, but these are very small moves. And this is a market that stood up to this story for the best part of the last 12 months. And my question this morning would be, how much has changed overnight? Has this story materially changed? And if so, this market's very offside. But at the moment, as has been the case for the last 12 months, inflation expectations have been very well anchored and the faith in central bank independence has been maintained. Has that changed this week?
The biggest change is potentially pushback from Republicans. You're mentioning North Carolina's Thom Tillis. There are others as well who have come out and said this makes them very concerned about who they pass through to the broader committee to vote on in terms of the next Fed chair, any other Fed appointees, because a lot of people in Congress understand the importance of an independent Federal Reserve. Now, some of the corrective measures come into focus, but there is a question: who is behind this, and whether the administration really wants to see some sort of criminal prosecution of Fed Chair Jay Powell.
This week is going to be fun. Lots coming up. Tomorrow morning, inflation data and bank earnings kicking off as well. You'll hear from JP Morgan, numbers from Delta as well. You'll hear from Bank of America, Wells, Citi, Goldman, Morgan Stanley. All of those guys are going to be reporting through the week. The pressure on these guys gets a little bit more interesting with the pressure building on interest rate costs for credit card issuers. And I wonder what that sounds like on the earnings call of some of these players over the next few days.
President Trump wanting to cap all credit card expenses at 10% interest rates versus the 20 to 30% that are currently charged. This comes as a lot of banks have been firing on all cylinders, are going to be reporting good profits. Real question of whether they're going to try to assuage some of the concerns coming from the White House with this populist overtone by maybe saying we're going to invest more in some of the sort of sustainable aspects and the military aspects of the United States. We believe that we're making America great again. I mean, just look for the rhetoric to change around this.
I think it's important to note that the president said this was effective January 20th. That's in a week and a day's time. The issue is, and he said this last night, that they need to follow the law. There is no law. There is a bill circulating in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and I think it's important to note this bill stems from the populist wings of both parties. It stems from Senator Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley, and an individual who tweeted at the president before the president decided to come out with this policy goal he has was no other than Bernie Sanders. And my phone blew up, and people said to me, and people on Wall Street, Annmarie, were worried about Zoran. What do you have now?
This is just the last week. Just the last week. You've had credit card companies hit on capping fees. Home builders have been hit about curbing investment. And then you've also had defense companies whipsawed on capital returns. And that is just the last week. And I'm leaving about 5 different things off.
As we're talking, I'm just thinking I've got a terrible headache. It's getting worse and worse as I try to put it all together. And it's so funny as we talk to people. It's as if people are stammering to try to keep up and figure out what exactly remains the same. And it turns out much of what their investment thesis is remains the same. So at what point is it noise and at what point is it signal?
Constructive into year end looking for 77.50.
Exactly.
It's usually how the conversation goes.
Yeah, I know who that is.
Equity futures right now, the S&P 500 negative by 0.6%. There's about 5 different people.
Evercore, that's true. That's true. too. Fair enough. Carry
Coming
on.
up this hour, we'll catch up with Russ Brownback of BlackRock as a new threat to Fed independence shakes markets. Henrietta Trays of Veda Partners joins us as President Trump calls for a cap on credit card interest rates, and Nouriel Roubini forecasting a thriving U.S. economy through 2030. We begin this hour with the Justice Department setting up a legal fight at the Federal Reserve.
No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
Joining us now to discuss a man who's tracked this institution for decades, Mike McKee. Mike McKee, that is a clear escalation overnight.
And an extraordinary one. The idea that the Fed chair would come out and accuse the administration of essentially extortion is something that has never been done before. And I've never seen anything along the lines of Powell's open attack on the president last evening. But then this is a very unusual time. It's important to remember that Powell has not been indicted for anything. This is a criminal subpoena from the D.C. U.S. attorney, who is an ally of the president, asking for documents on the Fed's renovations of two buildings on its campus. We saw Bill Pulte, the FHFA head, a couple of months ago argue that Powell lied about those renovations when he testified to Congress. But so far, no charges. We'll have to see how far this goes. It has hit the markets hard, at least this morning for the time being, although they may have a bit of a taco trade here. But you've got Krishna Guha from Evercore saying, we're stunned by this deeply disturbing development, which came out of the blue. It looks as if the administration and the central bank are now in open war. And then the folks at Brown Brothers Harriman this morning saying these actions threaten the Fed's inflation-fighting credibility and can accelerate the dollar's declining role as the primary reserve currency. So a lot at stake here, even if the markets are sort of focused on this for a bit of time and then move on to the next thing. Where do we go from here? Well, the big question is, will there be an indictment? We saw that the administration couldn't get indictments to stick for Jim Comey and Letitia James. This may be something similar. The Tillis opposition freezes the chair's nomination because there's a 13-11 split between Democrats and Republicans. So one Republican defecting leaves the committee deadlocked, and the nomination, whoever it is, doesn't go forward. Powell's chairmanship will end in May, as you guys were talking about, but he can stay on as a governor. And if he remains as governor, he could remain, in the absence of anyone else, as chairman of the Open Market Committee that sets interest rate policy. They get to pick their own chair, and one would assume they would rally round Jay Powell under these circumstances.
Mike McKee with the latest. Mike, thank you, sir. We'll come back to you a little bit later on this morning. Here's the view on Wall Street right now. So stocks are lower, bond yields are higher, the dollar's weaker, Fed independence very much in focus. Russ Brownback of BlackRock joins us around the table to discuss. Russ, good morning.
Morning.
Our good friend Rick Reeder would say the market can only focus on the shark closest to the boat. That used to make sense to me. There are so many different sharks now, every 5 minutes. I don't know what to focus on. What should we focus on?
So in your lead-in, you were talking about all the different headlines, so many over the last 10 days, you couldn't even remember them all. And yet, let's look at the markets and where they sit this morning. The 10-year note's at 419. It's a great statistic for you. End of Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 last year. Closing yield, 421, 423, 415, 417. So the markets, I think, have correctly, gravitated to the positive fundamentals, which is a disinflationary boom that's taking place in the economy. And I think the markets, until there's such time as there actually is real, fire where there's smoke, will continue to do so.
Are you saying just ignore all of the headlines, or is there something else taking hold under the surface that you can see maybe in gold and silver and the dollar, and maybe that's coming out through channels aside from just the benchmark yield?
Yeah, so, it's the golden age of income. It's underpinned by resilient, dynamic fundamentals in the U.S. economy and a disinflationary boom. And those are very powerful transcendent forces. And I think markets are correct to focus on those. If something comes along that is newsworthy, that can alter that fundamental path, markets will react.
At a certain point, I do wonder if there is a signal here about focus on affordability and a focus on using the government's balance sheet and the government's heft to really enact populist policies. At what point does that make you think, okay, at some point maybe people will start caring about the deficit again, considering the fact that if there is this much pressure on affordability, how much can really tariffs go up? How much really can they shrink the deficit?
Yep. So, listen, I think one of the ways that you can sort of outrun deficits is with fast nominal growth. The story that's not told, let's go back to kind of the middle of last year. The conventional wisdom around growth prospects for 2025 were kind of 3.5 nominal. Okay, we're going to end up at 5.5 nominal. So 200 extra basis points of NGDP is $600 billion. Okay, so that transcends the discussion about the marginal tariff revenue and the like. So outrunning the deficit, running the economy hot, has actually been what's happened over the last 4 years and what will likely happen again in 2026.
What's going on overnight with the Federal Reserve? Does it change your thinking about who Trump will nominate as the next Fed chair?
I'm not going to get into a discussion about the specific personnel. I think the Fed has really, quite frankly, done a terrific job in terms of being pragmatic, enabling rate cuts at a time when the spot inflation levels are above, their long-term target. The precedent for that is the early 1990s. Another amazing statistic, 80 consecutive months in the early 90s where you didn't have a core inflation reading on a trailing 12-month basis at or below 2%. The Fed cut the funds rate 400 basis points cumulatively over that time. I think that's what's taking place today. And I think the data, as it evolves over the course of the next year, will enable more of that.
Nouriel Roubini is going to join us later this hour, and he's going to say something very similar to what you're saying. This economy can withstand some of the shocks that we're discussing every single day. What is it about this economy, this market, our institutions in America that help us stand up to some of these shocks?
I think it's dynamism, resiliency. It's a culture of innovation. And I think, what we will be talking about as this year progresses is that, the growth potential, the speed limit on the U.S. economy is inflecting higher. And so if you're going to have 2.5% real growth, but the growth potential is 3%, you're actually creating slack in an economy. And so that's and I think Professor Roubini will probably suggest that growth potential is moving higher still. And I'm a productivity optimist.
When you talk about the speed limit, are you suggesting also that we can run this economy hot, that we can get loads of growth without the corresponding inflation?
So, running the economy hot would actually be running it above the growth potential. I would argue that, the growth has been accelerating this year, but it's not keeping up with how fast productivity is pushing potential. That's a very virtuous outcome.
Russ, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here. Russ Brown back there of BlackRock. I imagine you hear something very similar from Nouriel Roubini later this hour. Now, those of you who are thinking Nouriel Roubini are thinking, terrible growth figures, super bearish. It's not what you're going to get a little bit later this hour. He is very bullish on growth going forward from here.
And he sees the U.S. as the epicenter of that with productivity and the productivity boom that we've started to see and some of the data really continuing. And this is the hope. This is the reason why you have seen people pour into the United States despite some of the concerns around policy uncertainty.
Concerns about Fed independence this morning. Equities down just 0.6%. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. With more, here's Yahira. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, John. A group of European nations is discussing plans to boost their military presence in Greenland. Sources telling us here at Bloomberg, the UK and Germany are leading the talks, with Berlin proposing a joint NATO mission to bolster Arctic security. President Trump saying the U.S. must take Greenland because if it does not, Russia or China will. Meanwhile, Venezuela releasing political prisoners over the weekend, including a member of opposition leader Maria Corina Machado's party. The move coming after authorities said a significant number of prisoners would be released as a, quote, gesture of peace. The U.S. may remove Venezuelan sanctions as early as this week to help oil sales. And Indonesia and Malaysia are the first countries to ban Elon Musk's Grok AI over its generation of sexual content. Indonesia's Ministry of Communications and Digital Affairs imposed a temporary ban on Saturday aimed at protecting citizens from faked pornographic content, they say. Malaysia's internet regulator then followed. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Yahira, thank you. Thanks for the update. More from Yahira in about 30 minutes' time. That Russ Brownback stat just a moment ago made me go to the Bloomberg terminal just to look, not because I didn't believe you, but just seeing that quarter end. 420, first quarter, second quarter 423, third 415, fourth 417. How well anchored that 10-year maturity has been in the bond market. Amazing.
It's been the stability that a lot of people keep pointing to and saying, look, for all of the concerns, the bond markets remain balanced and actually could be biased to going lower through the remainder of this year.
419.30 this morning. Up next, the major affordability push.
I want a cap on credit card interest rates because, some of them are 28, almost 30%. No way. We're putting a one-year cap at 10%, and that's it.
A conversation up next with Henrietta Treyz of Vader Partners, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Stocks are down this morning by 0.5% on the S&P 500, negative by 0.8 on the Nasdaq. Coming off all-time highs Friday at the close, just a slight softness this morning off the back of this Federal Reserve independence concern that really ignited over the weekend once again. In the bond market, 2s, 10s, 30s, seeing that leakage at the long end of the curve. 10-year bond yield tied by 3 basis points, 30s up by 4. Under surveillance this morning, a major push for affordability.
I want a cap on credit card interest rates because, some of them are 28, almost 30%. And people out there, they're working and they have no idea that they're paying 30%. No way. We're putting a one-year cap at 10%, and that's it. They've really abused the public. The credit card companies have totally abused it. I'm not going to let it happen.
So here's the latest this morning. President Donald Trump doubling down on his call for a cap on credit card interest rates, his latest effort to address the cost of living crisis ahead of midterm elections later this year. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us now from Washington for more. Tyler, the president's own words, no way we're putting a one-year cap at 10% and that's it. Is that it?
Well, John, at this point, we're going to have to see what Congress ultimately takes up because he's going to need them in order to get this done. Though it is worth mentioning that credit card rates have become a target on both sides of the aisle. Senator Bernie Sanders last year teamed up with Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, putting forward a bill that would propose a 10% rate. Though at the moment that hasn't gone anywhere, there might now be some renewed pressure behind it to get it done. And while not the same thing, I will point out that then Senator J.D. Vance once teamed up with Senator Elizabeth Warren on a bill that would cap credit card swipe fees. So there really might be an appetite, though it is hard to imagine that anything's going to get through by the president's January 20th deadline. That means the onus is now going to be on the companies to do this voluntarily, though it is worth pointing out President Trump didn't outline how these lenders would be breaking the law if they don't comply. But there's been some common themes here, as you mentioned, from President Trump's recent policy announcements over the past week that have really moved stocks across the board, including his proposal to ban institutional investors from buying single-family homes. And one is, yes, this focus on affordability, but the second is that it requires Congress, but also some of these ideas do have that support from progressives. Now, we will point out that banks have long said that there needs to be a high rate because of the inability to cushion losses, and say cap could mean millions of Americans could be on the brink of losing access to credit. So it's something to watch closely, John, how this ultimately evolves. But keep in mind, President Trump did propose this on the campaign trail. And as we get closer to the State of the Union and we get closer to the potential of a second reconciliation package, I would expect these proposals to come up a lot more frequently.
Tyler Kendall in Washington. Tyler, thank you. To build on this conversation, Henrietta Treyz of Vader Partners. Henrietta, welcome. Let's just start here because there's a lot to get through. So the push to cap interest rates on credit cards. How much support does this have down in Washington?
It's got a lot of support. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders love it. But I got 2 words for anybody expecting legislation like this to pass. Chuck Grassley. He has backed opposing this legislation with the bank lobbies since the great financial crisis. So honestly, if you close your eyes and listen to what the president's saying, it sounds a lot like Dick Durbin on the Senate floor talking about swipe fees. This is something that needs legislation. One-year policy is not how Congress likes to act. And I would just say, as always, count the votes. You've got a 1-seat majority in the House of Representatives, a Senate that is totally dominated by the War Powers Resolution, Federal Reserve nominations, and now, obviously, a government shutdown pending on January 30th. You're not moving legislation like this.
Well, let's talk about the Federal Reserve. I'm sure you've seen the news on the subpoena delivered to the Fed and Jay Powell's response, and Senator Tom Tillis saying he's going to impose the confirmation of any nominees for the Fed, including the upcoming Fed chair vacancy, until legal matter is fully resolved. Where does this leave the rest of the Republicans, do you think, Henrietta, in the Senate?
You know, as a former Senate staffer, I would say there's some really cool stuff that's been happening on the Senate side. You saw 5 Republicans buck the president on the war powers resolution last week. Last year, 4 discharge petitions passed in the House of Representatives, which is usually something you never see. We're seeing contention rise in the Republican ranks on ACA subsidies, defense spending, these credit card bills, and the general affordability narrative. The party is not going along in lockstep. And what happens really in D.C. is the president gets one shot on goal. You got the one big beautiful bill that passed on the 4th of July, and that is it. Now we're working with executive actions only. The best thing the president can do is turn his attention to the tariffs, let the Supreme Court take them off on Wednesday, hopefully, and then leave them off. That is what he's going to be able to accomplish, is jawboning and executive action. Legislation is not realistic in 2026.
Well, he's going to be able to appoint a new Federal Reserve chairman, though. And when it comes to that, do you think individuals like Senator Tillis are going to have maybe a little bit more influence now on this Oval Office?
Yeah, absolutely. Senator Tillis, and one of the things we talked about in the lead up to President Trump winning the election was obviously what he's going to do with Powell. This has been going on for over a year now, this narrative around him firing Powell, and this is his second major attempt here. And one of the things that you can see in the Senate is if the Republican conference wants to exert any of their authority, Mitch McConnell can hold this up. John Thune can hold this up. Senator Tillis obviously is prepared to. Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, who's up for a very tough reelect in Maine. There are other members who are going to want to run for president in 2028. Josh Hawley, Todd Young. Those members have all the power in the world to stop this fiscal dominance on the Fed, and they're going to be rewarded by the street if they do so, and they know that.
Henrietta, how much pushback is there actually from Republican congressmen to President Trump? Is this just directly correlated to his popularity ratings? And they're just sort of watching that and deciding whether or not to go along with what he says or to try to carve somewhat of a different profile?
It's a good question. It's different for each topic. You would have thought that the defense sector was an area where he'd be really safe. But look at the pushback that $1.5 trillion in defense spending has gotten. Look at the pushback to the war powers resolution. Even that stuff's not safe. It's my view that the president is already in lame duck territory. There are some members who have to run as close as possible to the president, mostly because he's a vote turnout machine. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are not popular. Donald Trump is popular with his voters, and they turn out to vote. Going into a midterm, you got to rely on independents and know that you're going to be dealing with a Democratic voter base that's going to come out all day, every day to vote early and often. And that's what they've got to run against. So Trump is effective in certain districts on certain topics, but everywhere else, the party's got to run away from his tariffs, away from price increases, and everything except for gas prices. That's a really tough dynamic, and we're already in the primary and general election season for November.
It's January 12th. It's a long year ahead of us. Hey, Henrietta, thank you. Henrietta Trace there of Vader Partners on the latest. It's going to be a long, long year and a lot of ideas being thrown against the wall.
Ideas. Keyword, ideas. So what comes to fruition and how much can the market really look past? Because at some point, one of these ideas could gain traction, right? I mean, we did get tariffs. So there's a real question here about whether there is some signal here.
I have a very long list of what's already happened for 2026. A lot of these have echoes of the campaign trail of 2024. The only one I think that is actually happening is directing the FHFA to buy more mortgage-backed securities. But how much is that now going against what's going on in the bond market because of the push to get Jay Powell out?
We can talk about that next. Coming up on the program, we'll catch up with the Federal Housing Director, Bill Palti, reportedly a key force behind the Fed subpoenas. Plus, Danny has your morning movers. Busy morning already, about 2 hours away from the opening bell. Equity futures negative by, let's call it 0.5% on the S&P 500. On the Nasdaq, we're down by 0.8. Fed independence very much in focus, but in the bond market, not seeing major moves. Check out the 10-year, still around 420. Kind of been pinned there over the past few days. Yields up by 3 basis points on 10s, on 30s up by 4 to 485. And in the FX market, just seeing that dollar weakness. Seen a fair bit of that in G10 this morning, weaker against every single major currency. The euro positive by 0.4%. Lisa, 116 83.
Yeah, this has been the release valve, as we were talking about earlier. You can also see it when it comes to precious metals. A question, though, of how much more this has to go, about whether this really is about the United States or whether just globally you're seeing debt increase to such a degree that central banks are facing an increasingly difficult quagmire of keeping rates low. At the same time, the interest expenses are going up pretty significantly.
That Fed meeting at the end of this month, before we get there, another read on the economy. You'll hear that from the big banks on Wall Street. Look out for that tomorrow. JP Morgan kicking things off tomorrow morning. Also, 8:30 Eastern Time, a read on inflation. Before we get to all of that, lots of stocks to talk about. Morning movers available right now with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. And we start this morning much how we started last week. Movers based on policy, or at least desired policy, coming out of the White House. Credit card companies, I showed you them the last hour. We've been talking about them all morning, have been falling in the pre-market trade after Trump saying that credit card companies would need to cap interest rates at 10% or be in violation of the law come January 20th. Some questions about whether that can actually be implemented. But one of the consequences, I wanted to show you what the buy now, pay later firms, like a firm like Klarna, are doing this morning. By the way, the Klarna CEO coming out in support of that policy this morning. Mike Mayo, Wells Fargo, saying they would be the beneficiaries because capping rates would mean credit cards take on less risky customers, and those customers flock to buy now, pay later. Another company moving this morning based on the president's words is Exxon. Shares down 1%, with President Trump saying he would be inclined to exclude Exxon from any rebuild in Venezuela after the CEO, Darren Woods, saying at that conference of oil executives that Venezuela would be uninvestable, throwing some skepticism onto the desire to go in there and rebuild. Finally, Lululemon out with an update, and it was a beat for their first quarter. So much negativity around Lulu. Shares were up more than 1%. They paired some of those gains, just up 1/3%, but it does represent some positivity, especially for the holiday quarter, that they did get good sales and maybe some relief over Elliott Management and activist investors that they are facing, John.
They had a tough year, that's for sure. Danny, thank you. Thanks for the update. On our radar this morning, one of our top stories, Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell saying the central bank has been served grand jury subpoenas from the Justice Department. Powell claiming the threat of criminal charges are pretext to undermine Fed independence. Elsewhere, the president calling for a one-year cap on credit card interest rates at 10%. Trump adding the companies will be in violation of the law if they do not comply by his January 20th deadline. And finally, the president looking at potential responses to deadly protests in Iran, including military strikes and sanctions.
We're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it, and we're looking at some very strong options. We'll make a determination.
The Wall Street Journal reporting the president is meeting with senior administration officials tomorrow about U.S. involvement.
So if the president says that he is going to go and help the Iranians and he's looking at potential options, it's no wonder to me that he's going to be meeting with his team. I think what was interesting overnight is the president saying that a meeting is being set up with the Iranians, but he may take action beforehand. And then the Iranians actually responded and saying there is communication between the Iranian foreign minister and Steve Witkoff. Messages are exchanged whenever needed. So potentially the Iranian regime is really feeling the heat from these protesters, horrific scenes coming out of Iran, and potentially are looking for an off-ramp with this administration.
Some big questions coming from the meeting tomorrow with President Trump. Number one, is the U.S. willing to put boots in the ground? Because so far we haven't necessarily mobilized people to go over there to protect some of the troops that are currently in the region, as well as to back up any additional forces, whether this is going to be cyber, whether this is going to be military. And then third of all, who will be the replacement to any kind of leadership change in Iran, and how intimately involved will the United States be with that?
You've tracked this country for a while, a number of years. You see things like this develop in Iran, small uprisings, and then they quickly end. Does this feel different to you?
This does feel a little bit different. Norman Rule was talking about how this is kind of similar, and he is right, to 2022, 2023. The reason why this feels different is also because President Trump has already taken decisive action on Iran's nuclear facilities in June, and he's saying he's willing to do so again off the heels of going into Venezuela and doing something that was on no one's bingo card this year, which is capturing their leader. So potentially there's more impetus. Also, you see a lot of individuals talking about what's going on inside Iran, and I haven't been there in a decade, but you do feel like there are more people who are there because it helps them at home and their pocketbook, less so because of ideology. So potentially there has been a shift within the younger generation that is joining the regime.
We'll keep tracking this story here at Bloomberg Worldwide. Turning back to the Federal Reserve, sources telling us, our colleagues here at Bloomberg, that a driving force behind the DOJ's decision to subpoena the central bank is the Federal Housing Finance Agency Director, Bill Pulte. Director Pulte's been busy over the last week. Some purchases of MBS in focus as well. Director Pulte, welcome to the programme, sir. You are cited in our story this morning. Just wanted to give the opportunity to respond to it. Bill, what was your role in the developments over the weekend?
The DOJ is outside of my purview. This is out of my purview. I don't know anything about it, and I would defer you to the DOJ.
Bill, you haven't been shy of sharing your thoughts on the Federal Reserve before, particularly over the last 12 months. You thought that the chairman would ultimately resign. He's standing firm. Do you think this push against the Federal Reserve is actually leading to unintended consequences and leading this Fed to dig in?
My main focus, John, has been on reducing mortgage rates to the extent that we can do it and increasing housing affordability. President Trump announced a huge thing last week when he decided that he was going to ban institutions from buying homes. Basically, the concept is that people should be living in homes, not corporations. You know, we have a supply problem in this country, and obviously we're working on the demand side of things because in some cases, affordability has gotten so tough that people don't even want to buy a home because of what Joe Biden did. And so we're reversing that. That's what we're focused on. We had a huge 1-2 punch last week. You saw mortgage rates move 25 basis points lower on the news that Fannie and Freddie have started to undergo a $200 billion mortgage bond buy. And I think you're going to see some very exciting things come out of Davos with regard to the president on housing in a week.
Director Pulte, you were with the president this weekend, I believe, traveling with him on Air Force One from Washington to Palm Beach. Did you talk about the Federal Reserve with him this weekend?
Obviously, I would never talk about anything that the president and I talk about. I would say this, that the president is laser focused on housing affordability and reversing what has happened these last 4 years. You look at the average mortgage payment under Joe Biden, it's skyrocketed compared to what it was under President Trump's first term. We are focused on bringing down not only the mortgage rates, but also the day-to-day cost in upkeeping homes, which has to do with, you know, whether it be your ongoing expenses, mortgage insurance, et cetera. There are so many pieces to the cost puzzle that at the FHFA, U.S. Federal Housing, we are working to reduce the cost burden that Americans have.
I know that you've seen the report from our colleagues. I've also got calls last night about this subpoena handed to the Fed and was told that you were part of it, pulling together a report that then went to the DOJ. I just wanted to go a sense from you. Did the president know this was coming? The Treasury Secretary know this was coming? Have you had any of these conversations?
Again, on that matter, I'd refer you to the Department of Justice.
Okay, well, we'll wait to hear from the Department of Justice. When it goes back to the mortgage-backed securities that you have been talking about, you've already been purchasing about north of $230 billion of them last year. There is a cap. Do you expect to reach that cap this year?
I think all options are on the table. President Trump is a president who keeps all options on the table. We announced this historic $200 billion buyback of mortgage bonds. This is a huge deal. And, you know, we'll keep all options on the table. Look, we're doing our part at Fannie and Freddie. Most presidents didn't even know Fannie and Freddie existed. Obviously, your community and Bloomberg and all of us in the private sector, we know the importance of Fannie and Freddie. But for the average day American, they don't understand because the presidents haven't made it a priority. The average Americans haven't understood that presidents had this authority until President Trump found this authority, which is basically to utilize these companies to be companies. Imagine that. Get people to show up back to work. You know, we had 16,000 people. We have 16,000 people at the two companies. When I showed up on the scene and President Trump came into office, they were all working from home. We'd go to these big buildings, air conditioning spewing everywhere, spending $50 million a year on leases. Nobody was in these buildings. So we have turned around Fannie and Freddie. They tried to get President Trump to sell the companies for the two companies together for $100 billion. I think the valuation of the companies is anywhere between $500 billion and some say up to $1 trillion.
A lot of people are hoping that there is some sort of initial public offering of those companies. Are you preparing them for that at some point later this year or next year?
We are fully prepared to do whatever the president would like us to do on that matter. We have been getting prepared. We are prepared just like we are with the institutional home buying ban, just like we are with home builders. We have a full set of things to do. And once the president decides what to do, we go about executing them.
Director Palti, a lot of people on Wall Street were pretty excited, actually, about your purchases of MBS, of mortgage-backed securities, and saying that this seems like it should be something that would bring down spreads. They were less excited about the idea of preventing institutions from buying single-family homes, saying that it really wasn't based in economics, considering that in certain regions in the country, there's actually a glut of houses, that this is not because of institutions that account for a relatively small portion of overall buyers. What do you say back about the economic fundamentals behind this type of proposal and why it would bring down affordability and increase the supply of houses, which is the ultimate issue that a lot of people say?
Well, it just makes economic sense. You talk about supply. I mean, you kind of gave me a narrative there, but if you look at the economic supply of things, the fact is you have, big corporations buying, using long-term paper, using their balance sheets to scoop up homes in a supply shortage, as we call it. And they're in some cases buying these homes for 20, 30, 40% less than Americans are doing it. President Trump was elected with a very, very popular mandate. Sometimes people don't remember because it was a year ago, but it was a landslide victory. And he was given a mandate to reverse these last 4 years of crazy inflation that happened under Joe Biden. And so I think it's very appropriate that we're doing everything that we can to reduce housing costs. And we're going to keep doing it, whether it's the institutional ban on buying, looking at all of the things that go into a home and owning a home. Americans need to own homes in this country, and we're committed to restoring that.
Director Palti, did you study this in terms of the supply-demand dynamic and whether it actually would reduce the cost of houses for individuals? Should there be a ban on single-family housing, on institutions buying single-family homes? Because a lot of people in the markets who have supported President Trump's policies, I'm thinking of Neil Dutta in particular, came out and said, this is faulty economics.
Well, of course I've studied it. I've studied it my whole life. I mean, I grew up in the housing business. I grew up in the building business. I was on the board of Pulte Homes for 4 years. I understand what institutional buying does. It's very powerful. I understand why Wall Street might not like it. But we serve the American people. We don't serve Wall Street. And President Trump is laser focused on doing the right thing, no matter who it affects in terms of their pocketbooks at the Wall Street level. He is laser focused on action, not talk, like so many of these Democrats, like Elizabeth Warren. For years, she would talk about, institutional buying. She didn't do anything. Joe Biden didn't do anything about it. President Trump is doing something about it.
Elizabeth Warren wanted to see an effort like this. Do you think the president is taking cues from some of the more populist wings of the Democratic Party?
No, I think Elizabeth Warren's going to have to take cues from us, or she's going to continue to look like a fraud, because she says all these things and then she does nothing about it. President Trump, he gets things done. He said, look, we're going to ban institutional buying. And then we're going about both on an executive action front as well as codifying it in legislation. I mean, the amount of momentum that we've had at the legislative level from different Congress people. I was at the Financial Services Committee the other night. People were ecstatic about this. I also talked with multiple U.S. senators, many who are vying to sponsor the legislation. So this is a very big deal, and I think it's going to happen.
Is the president going to declare a housing emergency in the United States?
That's entirely up to the president. I can tell you this, he is treating it with great urgency. He understands real estate very well. He understands the importance of keeping home prices up. He understands this issue very well, and we're working very well together. Secretary Turner, Secretary Bessent, Secretary Lutnick, the Vice President, Susie Wiles. This is an all-hands effort. James Blair in the White House. I mean, this is an all-hands effort to reduce the cost of home ownership and get people, not corporations, back in homes.
We look forward to seeing what comes of that effort. Director Palti, we appreciate your time this morning, sir. Thank you very much. The Federal Housing Director, Bill Palti there, of the Federal Reserve, kinda, but much more on what's going to happen with housing in this country.
Yeah, after the announcement of buying $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities, which a lot of people credit for reducing mortgage yields on Friday. A real question, though, about further involvements and exactly what a proposal to ban institutional buying of single-family homes would actually do to prices.
And the president says he's going to talk about this at Davos. We know for months that they were talking about maybe declaring an emergency. Maybe he comes out at Davos and does that. But I thought was interesting, he said all options are on the table when it comes to the cap. Well, the cap was put in place after the financial crisis. So potentially $200 billion, the president directing them to buy more. Actually, that might just go up.
And I know that the Director of Housing didn't want to engage in the topic, and I understand why. But the Federal Reserve is working against this effort with what's happening with the balance sheet over at the Fed. I think that's a conversation we've got to have.
They're allowing mortgage-related debt to roll off their balance sheet, and they're not repurchasing it. Are they going to participate by buying mortgage-related bonds with a new leader at the Federal Reserve? That could ultimately be one particular interest of Director Palti's. Director Palti has also been aggressive in investigating the mortgages of some of the Fed governors. So there is a real question here about the intimacy between these two branches.
And I know he didn't want to comment on it, but my reporting last night from phone calls matches what Saleha Mohsen, Nancy Cook have, that he was a driving force, a leader of this when it comes to putting together a report, getting it to the DOJ about Jay Powell and what is going on with the remodeling at the Fed.
We'll come back to this a little bit later this morning. Let's get you an update on stories worldwide with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Yahara with more. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. President Donald Trump says he's inclined to exclude Exxon from his push for U.S. majors to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. Trump's comments coming after Exxon CEO described Venezuela as, quote, uninvestable at a meeting at the White House with other oil executives. Meanwhile, Walmart shares are rising 2.5% in the pre-market. The retail giant is getting ready to join the NASDAQ 100 index, replacing AstraZeneca. The changes are set to take effect before the market opens on January 20th. Walmart also announcing in the last 24 hours it's partnering with Alphabet to offer AI-enhanced shopping on Google's Gemini platform. And Alaska Air is launching a multi-million-dollar tech overhaul in the wake of painful outages that upended operations and hit earnings. CFO Shane Tackett telling Bloomberg the airline is weighing a massive move to cloud providers like Amazon and Microsoft to build system resilience. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Yahara, thank you. Appreciate your take. More from Yahara in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, Greenland in Washington sights.
If we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will take Greenland, and I am not going to let that happen. Sure, I'd love to make a deal with them. It's easier. But one way or the other, we're going to have Greenland.
That conversation up next with Bloomberg's Ollie Crook from New York City this morning. You're watching Bloomberg TV. In many ways unprecedented, the chairman of the Federal Reserve coming out swinging yesterday evening, accusing the White House of coming after its central bank independence. And this is the price action this morning in response. Negative by 0.5% on the S&P and the Nasdaq down by 0.7. In the bond market, yields higher at the long end of the curve. 10-year bond yields up by 3. 30-year bond yields up by 4 or 5. Now you might run away with the idea that the Sal America trade is back. These aren't big moves, but directionally, they speak to the same thing. Just a slow erosion, boosting, fueling that concern that we're chipping away at central bank independence.
The direction would suggest that. The fact that it isn't more is actually a significant signal. And how much is this that we haven't heard much response from President Trump? That yes, we had that message from Fed Chair Jay Powell, but we haven't heard a more concerted or coherent message coming from the White House about, this means he needs to leave, et cetera. We've heard attacks on Fed Chair Jay Powell for a long time. We've seen a lot of chipping away at this Fed institution's credibility. The fact that we haven't heard much is actually a signal in and of itself.
And Director Palti wouldn't even touch the story that he was involved in this, about the investigation, then passing it off to the DOJ. It also is interesting to me, the president had a chance to speak to reporters yesterday on Air Force One. He talked about Iran, about Greenland, about credit cards. Then the story came out about Jay Powell, the subpoena. We saw Jay Powell do this unprecedented, very rare video. The president immediately called NBC News to say, no, I had nothing to do with this, and this is not what I've wanted. I clearly think the administration is at this moment, this morning, wanting to take the temperature down.
I think the market's already desensitized. The amount of things we've thrown at the wall in the last week or so, threatening the territorial integrity of Greenland as well. So might as well talk about that too. Under surveillance this morning, Greenland in Washington sights.
If we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will take Greenland, and I am not going to let that happen. Sure, I'd love to make a deal with them. It's easier. But one way or the other, we're going to have Greenland.
So here's the latest this morning. President Donald Trump saying the U.S. needs to own Greenland and will secure the territory, quote, the hard way if a deal isn't reached. Representatives from Denmark set to meet in Washington on Wednesday. Bloomberg's Ollie Crook joins us now for more. Ollie, good morning. What's the response been like over in Europe?
I think it's very difficult for them to know what to make of this. This is clearly something that the Trump administration and Donald Trump is not letting go. And for the Europeans, coming up with a collective response here that is both firm but also does not anger or too confrontational with the United States has been a very difficult path for them to follow. As you mentioned, the Danish foreign minister will be in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. So will the sort of foreign minister for Iceland. They, of course, would potentially be quite concerned as well from what they're hearing about Greenland. And also the German foreign minister in D.C. today. What the Germans are proposing, and this is to deal with that concern that basically NATO and European NATO is not able to manage the security of the Arctic. The Germans, the UK, and some others are putting forward this idea of putting forward a sort of joint operation in the Arctic that's led by NATO and a number of different NATO troops in order to sort of beef up the security apparatus within Greenland. We should say the Danes have also been very open to the Americans coming in, having more of a military presence in Greenland, having a much larger presence in either more bases across Greenland or having more troops there. That is something that the Danes have said that they're very open to. That being said, what we heard from the president yesterday, he is not interested in leasing the territory. He's not interested in a temporary solution. He is interested in ownership. So the Europeans are trying to address the security part of that. But if this, for Donald Trump, is more about exploiting the resources of Greenland or potentially just expanding the U.S. landmass for his own legacy and for his own interests, that is going to be a very difficult thing for the Europeans to convince him, because the security will not be the driving goal here. It will be something much bigger and much different for the President of the United States.
Oliver, what about the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte? His very close relationship with the president. Is he going to be involved in this?
He will certainly be involved in this and trying to talk Trump down from this situation. But as you said there, and John referenced this earlier, I think what the kind of rhetoric that really concerns the Europeans is what we heard from Trump on Friday, saying that I'd like to make a deal the easy way. If we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way. That obviously sounds familiar, because that's exactly what Donald Trump said about Venezuela at the end of November. And 5 and 6 weeks later, we saw how that resolved itself. Now, it's very unlikely, I think, still at this point, to be considering about a military confrontation between the United States and NATO, but there is this new sort of special envoy for Greenland. There's been sort of discussions apparently within the Trump administrations about making direct pleas to the people of Greenland, saying potentially cash payments of $10,000 to $100,000 to people of Greenland. There are 57,000 of them. That would be less than $6 billion from the U.S. sort of budget. That's barely a rounding error for the military spend in the United States. So these are all sort of different ideas that are sort of floating around there. And of course, the Europeans are trying to find a collective approach. They may have a little bit of luck in buying some time, the United States, with its hands full with Venezuela and Iran at the moment. But again, the time is ticking on that.
Ollie, thanks for joining us. We'll keep tracking the story. Ollie Crook over in Europe. Without a doubt, Greenland is of huge geostrategic importance. And the president has, I think, done a tremendous job of highlighting that issue. But what is at play here is ultimately the president telling the Europeans and NATO members that they can't be trusted to defend that territory.
It's the method, not necessarily the goal. The goal of geopolitical security is one that has been put in place and a lot of people would agree with. Question is, what does the U.S. want that it doesn't have right now, considering the fact that we couldn't put more troops in the area, and potentially could the United States really break away from NATO?
Well, to John's point, the president has been talking about this since his first term. Yesterday, NATO puts out a tweet showing ships in the Arctic. They're practicing for the harsh conditions. Well, they probably should have done that 10, 15 years ago.
If you're just joining us, welcome. Futures down by 0.5%. The opening bell about 94 minutes away. Joining us to discuss next, Alicia Levine of BMW Wealth, Leslie Palti-Guzman of Energy Vista, Torsten Slock of Apollo, David George of Baird. The bank earnings just around the corner.
Coming into 2026, there's obviously been a lot of optimism.
I never want to bet against the resiliency of U.S. large caps.
When we break up the market and see where it's coming from, the bulk of it is coming from big tech.
You have to be very, very careful about how you invest long term at scale.
You have to be focused on fundamentals at the end of the day.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowicz, and Annmarie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning, good morning. For our audience worldwide, the third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance starts right now, and your scores look like this. Equity futures on the S&P 500 pulling back from all-time highs. We're down by 0.5% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, down by 0.7%. In the bond market, 2-year, 10-year, 30-year picture looks like this. Yields bleeding high at the long end of the curve, up by 5 on 30s to 486, up by 4 on 10s to 420. Going into quite a big week. Tomorrow morning, inflation data, tons of earnings as well. You hear from JP Morgan and Delta Airlines. Plenty of people have come on this program in the last 12 months and said the Federal Reserve is under siege. Central bank independence is threatened. Someone else came and did it in the last 24 hours, and this time it was the chairman himself.
That was the anomaly. That was the notable feature, given the fact that our reporting says that the Federal Reserve got the subpoena on Friday. Fed Chair Jay Powell chose to release a statement and an accompanying video commentary saying that this is not having anything to do with his testimony in front of Congress. This has to do with him trying to keep interest rates according to what he sees best fit rather than what the president would like, really opening the door to a real confrontation about Fed independence. The fact that we haven't seen a bigger sell-off, definitely notable. But watch this space, not just with bond yields, but also the dollar.
Tara Haynes of Pangea Policy says that this is a middle finger in public from the Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell to this administration. He goes on to talk about basically a self-inflicted Trump wound at a time when the markets need at least and when Trump needs at least. Because guess what? Jay Powell's up in months. And the President of the United States is going to have a chance to appoint someone else he might like. And now you have Senator Tom Tillis, senior senator in the Banking Committee, basically saying, I am not even looking at a new nominee until we have this subpoena and what's going on with the DOJ and the Federal Reserve cleared.
Not for me to say it was the right or wrong thing to do to put out that video statement yesterday evening, but it was certainly unusually confrontational from this chairman who's been asked about these kind of situations in the past and has really taken a step back and refused, I would almost say, to engage. This is a different Chairman Powell coming into 26.
Which is the reason why people are speculating this could mean he wants to stay on as a Fed governor even after his chairmanship goes up. He went on to say public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats, going on to say he will do what's in the interest of American people, not necessarily what is currently being told to him.
It is a huge shift from Jay Powell. I looked up what he said in December last night when he was asked about this. Quote, I'm focused on my remaining time as chair. I haven't got anything new on that to tell you. Well, last night he had something very new to tell us.
Can they fire you? No? Remember that one?
Yeah, I do.
News conference?
I remember the journalist who didn't have a follow-up. He was like, wait, hold on a second. You know, I have to say, the comment over the weekend that really got me was Peter Scheer of Academy Securities, where he said, expect a lot more announcements on many more subjects than you thought were possible, even in your wildest imagination. Let your imagination run wild with what could come up as a potential policy, because for this administration, out of the box is the norm, and not trying to get ahead of it could cost you. It seems like we're all just sitting here thinking our imaginations are sick of being wild. Maybe it's just we don't want to tame them a little bit.
Did he conclude by saying buy stocks anyway? None of it matters.
100%. He also said probably this means that bond yields are going to go lower, all things being equal, so it will give some sort of tailwind.
I do wonder if this dip gets bought before the end of today. We're down by 0.5 on the S&P. Coming up this hour, Alicia Levine of BNY Wealth. The stocks are sliding. Leslie Palti-Guzman of Energy Vista with geopolitical uncertainty weighing on the oil markets, and Torsten Slok of Apollo on the future of Fed independence. We begin this hour with stocks falling as tensions grow between the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
So here's the latest this morning. Fed Chair Jay Powell insisting Fed independence is under attack, leading to investors trimming exposure to U.S. assets. Joining us around the table, Alicia Levine of BNY Wealth. Alicia, good morning.
Good morning.
It's just another thing against the wall that we need to consider. Lots of things being thrown against the wall in the last week alone. Does any of it matter?
So it's interesting. I think our headline on 2025 was "The noise is noisy." And the headline on 2026 is "The noise continues to be noisier and ratcheted up." And so ultimately, as investors, we have to think through what have we learned in the first 6 trading days of the year that's fundamentally different, and what's happening with corporate America and earnings. And that's really where you have to lie, because the conversations are interesting and fascinating and do have impact on what's happening in the markets and what's happening in corporate America. But ultimately, how much of this just continues to be the noise? And it's a difficult situation. It's not easy because we can get focused on all of these issues and we have to decide what to do with the capital.
Let's take the first 12 days. Lots of things announced. Stocks grind higher. Decent start to the year. Does that change as we look further out this year?
So I think when we came into this year saying, look, we see earnings up 14%. We see the S&P, we're in that, our top of the range is about 7,600 because we see a very nonlinear year. Because we continue to see more policy actions coming out that could rattle markets here and there. And ultimately, you start the year at 22 times forward earnings, you're just going to have a more sensitive market. Now, we've been at 22 times forward earnings for the last 15 months or so, but you can see that there's just more vulnerability on the volatility side, if not necessarily on the fundamental side. So dips will be buyable here, but you're going to get days like this and like we had last week with all the different announcements about housing and credit card rates and everything else.
A lot of people agree with you, and they do think that the market, amid some volatility, will creep higher through the end of the year. Where they disagree, and the consensus disagrees, is that the rest of the world will continue to do better than the United States based on a lack of certainty around U.S. policy and a weakening U.S. dollar. Why do you disagree with that?
So we have actually raised our allocations to international a little bit more at the end of last year and into the beginning of this year because we see something of a softer dollar this year. Not what we saw last year. Last year, the dollar was down about 9.5%. We don't see that again this year. We don't see Flee America here. You're getting echoes of it today, but I don't think that's the conversation this year. Ultimately, as an allocator, you want to think about where is the ball going overall. You can make tactical trades, but ultimately the U.S. is the most dynamic economy, and ultimately that's where you want to be invested. I don't think the rest of the world can outperform on fundamentals over the U.S., but you can certainly have months or quarters where international markets do better, and that's what we saw last year as well. If you're doing fundamental analysis, the growth is here. The productivity is clearly here. We're clearly on a productivity upswing in the 2020s. We expect that to continue, and you see it in the margin growth in the S&P as well.
And a lot of that has to do with technology and what's going on with artificial intelligence, et cetera. I do want to dig into some of the sectors that you like, financials in particular, especially ahead of bank earnings. We've seen a huge outperformance in the KBW Bank Index, something like 15% in the past 3 months versus less than 4% on the S&P 500. At what point is that threatened? Based on some of the policy threats that might not be put into practice exactly, but in spirit a little bit more so.
So I don't think we've learned anything new. I don't think we've learned anything much new in the last week. We understand two things, that the government wants a steeper yield curve and the government wants deregulation. That is so good for the small and medium-sized banks and the regional banks and ultimately the larger banks as well. We just did a study on bank valuations. If you think about what deregulation did to the multiples of the banks before 2008, there is still room to run here, and there's still room to run on price to book as well. So if your overall framework is deregulation, there's further to go here. We don't think this trade is done. We think it's a fun, steepening yield curve, deregulation, that's the sweet spot.
So when you have banks trading down on, because the president's talking about a 10% credit card interest rate cap, maybe today is a day you'd actually want to scoop them up?
I would say yes. I mean, ultimately, I think that's a legal challenge, right? I'm not a lawyer, but this is not an administrative decision. This is a legal issue.
When it comes to, you said that it's noisy last year, it's getting louder this year. Is there a chance the United States goes deaf? Meaning, is there any of these policies, like what's going on with the Federal Reserve, could potentially mean long-term damage to the investment case of the United States?
So I think that's a really interesting question. It's going to show up in the long end of the bond market, essentially, right? That's where the risk is going to show up as well. I mean, the equity market has been remarkably resilient. I'd say the bond market has been resilient as well here. It's a chipping away, right? It's clearly a chipping away. But I think it's a global issue because if you lose the investment case in the U.S., very hard to be very bullish elsewhere, right? We're the consumer of the world. We're the growth engine of the world. Very hard to say, well, then, like other places look great fundamentally, strategically.
I'm sympathetic to the idea this might not be a story for 2026, but I do think it's one we have to track. We've talked about this earlier this week, or rather in the last week. Things are flying by. I already feel like we're still in last week.
I feel like we're in 2028.
I know. Earnings have been fantastic. And you're right to point to earnings for the next 12 months. They were brilliant the last 12 months. Jobs growth was not. And I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to politicians on both sides. that the only thing they care about is staying in power. All they want to be is a politician and stay in office for as long as the eye can see. I think we can see that on the left and the right. And they have a lot in common right now. They're all pushing for the same kind of policies. Why? Because they think they're the kind of policies that will keep them in office. And that's why I think we have to take these policies seriously. I sat here earlier this morning and said that some of the ideas that I'm hearing from this administration are typically associated with the financially illiterate left when it comes to things like credit card costs. But you have to respect this. This is coming from a place where politicians believe these are the kind of ideas that will get them elected, which is why I think we have to take them seriously. Now, we can sit here and say it's not a story for 26, but I think it's going to be a story for 27, for 28. The President of the United States goes to Davos, Switzerland next week. He's going to deliver a speech and echo some of the kind of themes he's talking about. People on the left are going to come out and agree with him. And the people who feel like they've been left out from this massive, long bull market in America and elsewhere are going to vote for these proposals in the elections over the next 2, 3, 4 years. The biggest risk for this market are the kind of ideas that we all sit around this table and say, these are really rubbish ideas, they're not going to happen. The biggest risk for this market is they do happen. And they happen because politicians believe they're the kind of ideas that will help them get elected.
So when did they start getting priced? Right? I mean, at what point do people take them seriously, given the fact that they're coming from both sides of the aisle? And is it going to be some sort of proposal that actually gets through? We saw tariffs, for example. Everyone roundly said they were terrible ideas. And then they got through. And actually, people started to pay them. And you started to see people say, well, maybe they're not so bad. Well, honestly, you have to wonder at what point, given how many people are talking about them, they come to fruition.
No tax on tips. I don't know how many people said to me, Annmarie, it's just a 2024 election issue that the president needs Nevada. It's not going to happen. Well, guess what? It did happen. It was part of the one big beautiful bill. So to your point, maybe this doesn't happen in 2026, but there are senators on both sides that have already lined up a year ago for this bill. Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Josh Hawley.
The market needs Thatcher and Reagan all over again. Alicia, we'll leave it there. It's good to see you. Thanks for dropping by. Thank you. Alicia Levine there of BNY Wealth. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Yahara with more. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. Federal Chair Jerome Powell says the central bank has been served grand jury subpoenas from the Justice Department threatening a criminal indictment. Last summer, the Trump administration ramped up scrutiny of the cost of renovations of the Fed's headquarters. Powell says it's a pretext to end Fed independence. Trump denies having any knowledge of the investigation. Meanwhile, shares of major credit card issuers are falling in the pre-market after President Trump's demand they cap interest rates at 10% for 1 year. Trump saying if they don't comply by January 20th, they are in violation of the law. Not backed up by legislation, however, and Trump provided no explanation for how the lenders would be breaking the law. And box office numbers from the first full weekend of 2026 are in, and for a fourth consecutive week, Avatar: Fire and Ash remains in the top spot. The third movie in the franchise has surpassed $340 million in the U.S., officially cracking the top 30 highest-grossing films of all time. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
Yahara, thank you. More from Yahara in about 30 minutes' time. Up next, the morning calls. Plus, we'll catch up with Leslie Palti-Guzman of Energy Vista as geopolitical uncertainty is weighing on crude markets. That conversation up next. From New York City this morning, good morning.
I think this complicates the job for whoever the next Fed chair is, which was already going to be somewhat complicated in terms of expressing independence. This just makes it a little bit harder. My hope, not just as a market participant, but as an American, is that we lower the temperature on this, and this ends up being a kerfluffle, but the longer it goes on, the harder it is for that to happen.
I think everyone wants to lower the temperature on things. That was Steve Chevron of Federated. Your price action looks like this morning. Equity futures on the S&P 500 pulling back by 0.5%. We're down by 0.75% on the Nasdaq 100. That's the price action. Here are your morning calls. First up, JP Morgan raising its price target on Capital One, viewing President Trump's call to limit credit card interest rates as a, quote, low probability risk. The stock is down by 8.5%. Your second call from Bank of America upgrading Comcast to buy, highlighting industry consolidation and emerging opportunities. The stock is up by 1%. And your third and final call from Wells Fargo upgrading ConocoPhillips to overweight, seeing headroom for dividend growth. That's stock positive this morning by more than 1%. Let's stick with energy. The Exxon CEO, Darren Woods, calling Venezuela, quote, uninvestable, sparking backlash from President Trump.
No, I didn't like Exxon's response. We have so many that want it. I'd probably be inclined to keep Exxon out. I didn't like their response. They're playing too cute.
Tracking this story, Javier Blas of Bloomberg Opinion. Javier, welcome to the program. What did you make of the difference between Chevron's communications going into the weekend and Exxon's?
Well, there was a lot of difference both on substance and style. I think that you focus on what Chevron said was, Mr. President, we are already in Venezuela. We are going to continue and we can increase production. And there was a lot of thanks towards the administration. Exxon CEO went to the White House and effectively delivered a 101 class on the way that Exxon invests, and then ultimately told Trump to his face, Mr. President, your plan is not going to work. That's what means uninvestable. And I think that Trump is reacting in as we will expect it. I mean, the body language live on the broadcast of that meeting said everything. If you look at the chief of staff of Trump, she was extremely unhappy with Darren Woods. And if anything, my surprise is that it took almost 24 hours for the White House to make clear that they were not happy.
Javier, as you know, Exxon's been burnt over the years trying to go into that country. Chevron's still there, which I kind of think speaks to why there was such a difference between those executives going into the weekend. However, there is a middle ground here, and I'd like to sort of flesh that out with you. Many people have turned around and said, this is bad energy, bad crude, it's difficult to get it out, you can't sell it that easily, it's hard to scale up production in that country. Javier, do you take a bit of a different perspective on things?
I would say that yes, that is an argument, and I think that there is a lot of white and black discussion, black and white discussion about Venezuela. I take a middle ground. I think that there is potential for what I would call low-hanging barrels, if you forgive me for the metaphor. Those low-hanging barrels are not in the Orinoco, which is where the extra heavy oil is located. They are in the traditional areas of Venezuelan oil industry, Lake Maracaibo on the west, Monagas in the east, and you could increase production perhaps by 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 barrels a day over the next couple of years. I think that you listen to what the oil companies already on the ground in Venezuela, that Chevron, Repsol of Spain, Eni of Italy, they indicated that they are planning to do that. If you are thinking about increasing production by millions of barrels a day, then yes, you have to go to the Orinoco, and yes, that is difficult oil to extract, it's expensive, it's difficult to refine, but there is a middle ground on the story, and I think that over the short term we are going to see more Venezuelan oil coming into the market, but to see millions of barrels, that's going to take time.
Great work in the last week, Javier. Appreciate your time. Javier Blas there of Bloomberg Opinion on Venezuela. What does it all mean for Iran? Leslie Palti-Guzman, the founder of Energy Vista, writing, we are witnessing a remapping of global energy production if Iran undergoes regime change. Additional vast untapped oil and gas reserves could also re-enter global markets. Leslie joins us now for more. Leslie, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the programme. How different is this moment? It's a question we keep asking this morning. How different is this moment for Iran?
So Iran specifically, I think we've seen unprecedented protests. But what's different is that it goes beyond the women movement, and it goes also beyond the students and the youth. It's also a movement for the middle class, for the workers, the traders in the markets that have been really hit by the economic situation. Tehran is undergoing a huge water crisis, water shortage. There is even electricity shortage. Well, Iran has vast resources of oil and gas. And I think that following the summer, with the war between Israel and Iran and the strikes also with Israel and the US, the revolution, the Islamist revolution, is really undergoing a crisis and may never come back.
Leslie, there's a bigger question for the oil markets, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Venezuela, of how much oil has been locked up in regimes that are inaccessible to at least legal markets in the world that could come back online, and what that does to just supply-demand dynamics. I mean, do you have any estimates of how much oil, whether it's Iran, whether it's Venezuela, could come back online?
Yeah. So I would say first that this oil, the people, the population has not seen the benefits of this oil for decades, right? The despots in Venezuela we're using this oil to maintain the cronies and buying loyalties. Same for Iran. It's the Revolutionary Guards that are getting most of the money from this oil. Venezuela, the likelihood is that Chevron, who is already in place, will target the low-hanging fruits, a little bit of maintenance, repair of equipment, managing to bring back a few thousand barrels first, and then to get to the 2 to 3 million barrels a day will take much more time. From the meeting in the White House, we've seen that I've seen some excitement, but also some trepidation and caution, right? Excitement because it's the biggest jewel, right? Like for companies, it's like being a kid in a candy shop. You really want, it's a historical opportunity. But you have also many above ground risks. And if they are not addressed fast enough, companies are going to drag their feet. But I think also, some companies will take the risk.
Secretary Wright over the weekend said the Wildcats are ready to go into Venezuela. But he said when it comes to Exxon, they were an outlier. And he said, of course, they're going to be the last one to go back in. What kind of price does WTI need to be trading at for Darren Woods to say, OK, you know what, now's a good time to go try for Caracas a third time?
I thought his speech was very well formulated because it was a 3-point speech. Exxon needs a win-win-win for the government, for the population, and for the shareholders of Exxon. So the shareholder means we need a return on our investment. We're not going to get there if we know we're going to lose money, and he needs to know that his investment is going to be guaranteed for decades, not just for the time being of the Trump administration. It needs to be with a fiscal framework, with a legal framework. So right now, the Trump administration can guarantee maybe the political stabilization. There is still an armada of Navy posted in the Caribbean that are going to put pressure on the current interim government. So I think political stability is going to be there potentially, but then it's going to take more time. I think the price, right now, that's the main contradiction of the Trump administration. They want oil prices to be around $50 per barrel, but oil companies, and they need a little bit higher. But at the same time, our adversaries, Russia, key of them, is going to lose leverage with this kind of oil price.
Leslie, it's good to see you. Thanks for dropping by. Leslie Palti-Guzman of Vista Energy. Friday really highlighting that this country does not have a national oil producer.
Yeah.
And that ultimately these guys are accountable to shareholders, which is why you heard what you heard from the Exxon CEO.
Yeah, if you've been burned once and then you've been burned again and then you go in again, well, guess what? Shame on you, at least according to shareholders. That ultimately will be the boss that Darren Woods is going to appeal to.
Up next on the programme, we'll catch up with Torsten Slok of Apollo on the future of Fed independence. Plus, Danny has your morning movers. Credit card providers sliding after the White House aims to cap interest rates. The opening bell just around the corner, 60 minutes away. Your scores look like this. Equity futures on the S&P 500 down by 0.5. On the Nasdaq, negative by 0.7. With your morning movers, with more, here's Danny. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Just another check on the credit card companies this morning. All continue to decline in the pre-market move. American Express, Capital One, JP Morgan, Citi, Visa, all of them tumbling after President Trump saying that the credit card companies needed to cap interest rates at 10% by January 20th or consider themselves in violation of the law. Some questions as to whether he can actually do that or not. Walmart, that is gaining in the pre-market trade. A few things going on this morning. For one, NASDAQ says that it will be inducted into the NASDAQ 100. Jefferies pointing out that because of passive flows into the index, it will mean $19 billion flows in to Walmart shares worth of demand. They also are partnering with Gemini, with Alphabet's Gemini, allowing users on the AI platform to shop for Walmart products. So those shares up just under 4%. Finally, this morning, out moments ago, Shake Shack earnings. It was a miss for their fourth quarter. The company itself blaming bad weather in the Northeast for sales being less people coming in. But it does continue on this theme fast casual suffering. Kava, they downgraded their outlook, as did Wingstop. So you're looking at Shake Shack shares fall by 3.5% this morning, John.
Getting tough out there, that's for sure. Danny, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's go to the bond market. Look at this. Sometimes the market move doesn't meet the moment, because it was quite a moment yesterday evening. And this is the market move. Bond yields higher by just 3 basis points, failing to break out of a recent trading range, the 10-year 420.
It isn't an extreme move. A question of whether this is actually something that is going to undermine the Fed's independence or heighten focus on this to then give Republican senators, I'm thinking of Tom Tillis from North Carolina, a little bit more incentive to push back and maybe create some guardrails around any type of Fed discussion. There is now a discussion that President Trump is going to interview Rick Rieder of BlackRock this week as a potential Fed candidate. How much does this change potentially who he chooses who could actually get through the committee?
It's a good point. Secretary Bessent said that there will be an announcement, he thinks, before or after Davos. And then once Rick Rieder's done, that's it. Everyone has had their time for this interview with the president. So he will get a nomination. But I do wonder if, given where the market is trading, do we have something new now? Not a Powell put, not a Trump put, a Tillis put. Tom Tillis.
For now, the confirmation process is immensely important, and I'm with you. For now, and things are changing very quickly, this probably torches Kevin Hassett's potential of getting on that committee, doesn't it?
They don't want a loyalist because ultimately many congressmen as well as people in the legal world would like to see a little bit more of at least the appearance of independence. They don't want necessarily a yes man or someone perceived as a yes man to the president.
Let's stick with our top story, the future of Fed independence.
No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Mike McKee. Mike, we've gone over this a few times, and as I said just moments ago, the move in the market doesn't meet the moment, but this is a big moment. Can you frame not just the last 24 hours, frame the last 12 months? The Chairman Powell that handled the situation through 2025 and the Chairman Powell we saw yesterday evening.
Well, the president has been attacking Powell since his first term, and it just ramped up when he came back to office in January. The Fed's response, Powell's response, has always been to keep his head down, talk about the fact that he is not going to get involved in politics and he's just going to do his job. Something changed on Friday when they got the subpoena about a criminal investigation, and they decided now was the time to speak up, and Powell did it about as forcefully as you could, almost accusing the administration of extortion. Important to remember that he's not been indicted. This is just a criminal subpoena. We'll see where it goes. But it is ramping up of the tension between the Fed and the administration, and now it's roped in the markets. You were just talking about the markets not reacting as much as people might have thought. I suspect there's a bit of a taco trade to this. Markets don't think Trump would follow through with a criminal indictment. But what do the rest of Powell's colleagues think? We will have a lot of opportunity to hear from them this week. Starting today, Bostic Barkin and John Williams, the vice chair of the Open Market Committee, Musalem, Myron, Paulson, Kashkari, Barr, Barkin, Schmid, Bowman, and Jefferson, all speaking this week. And you can bet the subject is going to come up anytime they take questions and maybe even voluntarily in their remarks. Also a big economic week, which probably would have been what you and I would have been talking about right now. With CPI tomorrow, we have PPI on Wednesday, plus retail sales. Claims and Philly Fed on Thursday, and Friday industrial production. We're getting a lot of data in after we've gotten the jobs report that suggested maybe the Fed doesn't move. And now with all of this Powell stuff, it just raises a question of whether the Fed will not move to spite the president.
Precisely. And Mike, I think that's the key issue. The people we speak to, they take this issue seriously. And because they take this issue seriously, they believe the other people on the committee do as well. And there is a sense, and we've heard the argument a few times on the programme already this year, that they believe this will just galvanise the other members of the Federal Reserve to dig in. That the appointment of people like Governor Stephen Myron has unintended consequences. It leads to pushback on the committee. It galvanizes other members of the Federal Reserve. Do you think the same thing could happen with the events over the weekend?
Oh, absolutely. These are institutionalists. Nobody there is someone who was, except for perhaps Stephen Myron, somebody who thinks the Fed should be turned over upside down. There are a lot of calls for some reforms, but this is the kind of thing that challenges the institution itself and gets people's backs up. And as we were talking about in one of our earlier discussions, if Powell stays on as governor, I would expect the Open Market Committee, even if there's no new chairman, to renominate him as chairman of the Open Market Committee, which sets interest rates out of loyalty to him and as a rebuke to the president.
Mike, just frame that and go forward with that a few more steps. For a lot of people that just heard that for the first time, what do you mean? Are you suggesting that the president could nominate one guy, but the guy who runs interest policy could be another guy?
It's very possible. There's two scenarios. One is that the president appoints somebody and they're confirmed and the Fed wants to send a message. It may be somebody that they don't think is particularly reliable. The other is that nobody gets through the committee in time because Tom Tillis and others on the banking committee hold up any nomination. Philip Jefferson would become chairman of the Fed by law, but the Open Market Committee chooses its own chair, and they don't even have to work for the Fed. So they could pick anybody, and I suspect that Powell would be their choice for the interim.
They might pick Mike McKee. Who knows?
Maybe you. Maybe the president. He says that he
Possibly.
thinks it's the easiest job in Washington.
Michael, thank you. Appreciate it. Michael McKee breaking down a long list of issues for this institution. Torsten Slock of Apollo writes the following. The market reaction this morning is very muted, which is telling investors that the key issue continues to be the incoming data. Torsten joins us now for more. Torsten, good morning.
Morning.
Nice try. Still going to ask you about this. Tell me your thoughts this morning and your response to what took place yesterday evening.
I do think the market reaction is absolutely critical, especially the market reaction in long rates, the dollar, and also inflation expectations. And on all three fronts, we've had a relatively muted reaction. So one conclusion is that the market obviously is looking at this, and the reaction has been, as you would have expected, that rates are up a bit, the dollar is down. We'll see inflation expectations if they go up a bit more throughout the day, but it's still relatively small compared to how much drama has been made of this over the last 24 hours.
Is that a huge buy signal? Essentially, that this is a market that really believes in the institution of the Federal Reserve in the United States, checks and balances in a way that encourages you to invest in the United States?
Because investors come to the U.S. for two reasons. They come for AI and they come for higher yield. And when they come for higher yield, of course, it's because the rest of the world doesn't have great growth at the moment. And the level of yields for the Fed is, of course, higher than what it is for the ECB and for a number of central banks around the world. So for that reason, foreigners come to clip a higher coupon in bonds, and foreigners also come to get AI exposure. So for that reason, this is not directly linked as such to the AI story, but what this could be linked to is, of course, the yield story. If you begin to see the Fed lower interest rates, not for economic reasons, then the big question becomes, well, what would that mean for the steepness of the yield curve? Where is it foreign investors are investing? And if foreign investors are further out, then the risk is, of course, that the yield curve will be even steeper. And therefore, foreigners would be getting an even higher level of yield further out the curve. So there's a lot of issues around this question of why is the dollar not weaker? Namely because foreigners actually still like the AI story and they still like the higher coupon that they get in the US.
What would you have to see to suggest that the Sell America trade truly is starting to take off, that people are starting to take this seriously?
The dollar going down. Because that, of course, is ultimately the risk that foreigners will begin to say, well, we have less appetite for buying U.S. assets. But the key issue continues to be that the U.S. growth outlook continues to be much better than the growth outlook in Europe, much better than the growth outlook in Canada, Australia, Japan, because we have the AI data center boom and energy boom, of course, expanding everything over the next several quarters. We have the one big beautiful bill. We also have oil prices lower. We also have the dollar now marginally lower. All those tailwinds continue to support GDP growth throughout this year. Let's not forget that the one big beautiful bill is going to add 0.9% to GDP growth, according to the Congressional Budget Office in 2026. That's a very meaningful boost to GDP over the coming quarter. So that's why the consensus expects, if I look at ECFCGO and my Bloomberg, that the unemployment rate will peak just about now, and the unemployment rate is about to go down over the coming quarter. So that's a very important point when you think about the backdrop for this story about what's going on with the Federal Reserve these days.
When it comes to Sell America, what about, instead of the dollar depreciating, what about the fact that gold continues to hit new record highs almost on a daily basis?
I do think that this is also a reflection of a broader thing, namely that there's also the issue, of course, that central banks that are imposed with sanctions are now shifting away from dollars. dollars towards gold. You also have that many Chinese investors have been buying gold. They've been buying ETFs in China in a very significant way over the last several quarters that we haven't seen before. So retail demand is very strong, and you also have, because of sanctions, very strong demand. And of course, inflation in the US, let's not forget, which we normally, of course, talk about, is that it is still not at 2%. It's still closer to 3 than it is to 2. And that, of course, is the number one issue driving gold most frequently, namely that if inflation is higher for longer, and we have an economy that's about to get better because of the one big beautiful bill, the AI and data center spend, well, that raises the risk that there's also more upside risk to inflation over the next several months.
Torsten, GDP right now is tracking at what, 4 to 5%?
Well, the Atlanta Fed GDP now, as you know, is very, very high.
Pretty fantastic, and the last read we had was pretty decent too. 4 to 5%, and the president's going after the Federal Reserve. The president's looking to cap interest rates at credit card companies. The president's going after things that on the one hand are hurting home builders, on the other hand might help them. These are things we typically associated with GDP tracking closer to 1 or maybe in negative territory. What's gone wrong?
Well, I think a very important part of this discussion is that equity investors care about corporate earnings. And the last few earnings seasons have actually been pretty good. And corporate earnings still look pretty good if you look ahead. Consensus expectations are that earnings throughout this year will continue to rise. So if corporate earnings are still good, well, then equities likely say, you know what, if earnings are still good and these things are not impacting the bottom line, well, then we should still, of course, expect that equities could continue to do well.
That's Wall Street. What's gone wrong for Main Street?
Well, credit and bond investors, of course, have a lot of these things suddenly because this begins to matter in a number of different ways, especially, of course, when it comes to rates. So that's why it's more the bond market that's paying more attention to these risks. But even the bond market, the reaction today has had a very, very muted reaction. So that's why the conclusion here is as long as bond markets and credit markets continue to view this from a relatively complacent and benign perspective, then we should still be looking at this from the fundamental perspective.
Can we just park markets for a moment? Just throw markets over there. I just want to talk about the fact that we're generating 4 to 5% GDP growth, and yet everyone seems to be terribly unhappy. What is so bad about this kind of growth? What is the character of this GDP growth compared to what it used to be like? The jobless growth this time around, what has changed? What has gone wrong with the growth that we're producing?
Yeah, so the key issue to that is, of course, it's a K-shaped outlook both for consumers. We have high-end versus low-end, and we also have for corporates, are you in AI or are you not in AI? Those differences continue to drive that high-end consumer spend continues to be strong, and AI, of course, data center, energy build-out continues to be strong. Those things dominate the negative effects that might be coming from the lower leg of the K. And the labor market is really mainly a reflection of immigration. Remember, in the last several years, 2022 to 24, net immigration was about 3 million. The Congressional Budget Office is now predicting will be about 500,000. That's why the Federal Reserve produces a lot of papers saying that the equilibrium rate for non-farm payrolls is no longer 200,000 like it was for several years. Now it's 30,000. So that's why last Friday's number on non-farm payrolls is actually a pretty good number when you take that into account, that we actually have had such a dramatic decline.
So we should be happy with 50K.
Yeah, so 50K is actually better than this St. Louis estimate of equilibrium for non-farm payrolls, which is 30,000.
Again, so why is everyone so miserable?
Well, the stock market doesn't seem too miserable.
No, forget those people in the stock market.
Understood. So, but this is right. If you think about, of course, consumer sentiment, that's also been driven very differently according to where people are in the income distribution. But overall, it's still very clear that the economy is actually still in decent shape. And if you now have the tailwinds coming from the one big beautiful bill, again, 1% according to the CBO in growth being added this year, you still have data centers spent out, and you still have also, of course, everything going on with lower dollar, lower oil prices. All that are really strong tailwinds to the growth outlook for the next several quarters.
Do American people feel the same way? Because the president's clearly responding to something. When he goes to Davos, Switzerland in a week and talks about this great affordability push, obviously he doesn't believe that the consumers in America see things the same way.
Well, of course, affordability is a little bit different discussion because it is correct that on a number of different fronts, of course, home prices have not done particularly well. There's also, of course, other areas with tuition, healthcare, etc., where the discussion has been very important. But nevertheless, the wealth effect for consumers has been strong. Job growth has still been relatively decent. At the same time, you now actually saw wages go up on Friday. You still have a number of tailwinds that mean that on average, the U.S. consumer, the weekly data from Redbook, same-store retail sales, impressively strong, still telling you that in aggregate, the net effect of the K is still that the higher end of the K is dominating the overall picture for where the macro data is.
We hope things turn around for everybody else pretty soon. Torsten, good to see you. Thank you, sir. Torsten Slok there of Apollo. Let's get you an update on stories worldwide with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Yahara Anand. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. Walmart is partnering with Alphabet for an AI shopping assistant. Customers will be able to purchase apparel, food, and more from the Gemini browser or mobile app. This is in addition to Walmart's partnership with OpenAI to let shoppers buy items on ChatGPT. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's Grok AI is banned in Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia's Ministry of Communications and Digital Affairs imposed a temporary ban aimed at protecting citizens from faked pornographic content. Malaysia's internet regulator then followed suit. And in sports, a wild opening weekend to the NFL playoffs. Even I tuned in with 4 of the 5 games decided in the final minutes. The 49ers took down the defending champs in Philadelphia, while the Rams held off the Panthers on a game-winning touchdown pass. Elsewhere, the Bears mounted an 18-point comeback to stun the Packers, as the Bills and Patriots both secured their spots in the divisional round. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
Yahara, thank you. Appreciate it. Up next, we'll set you up for the day ahead. Plus, we'll catch up with David George of Baird, looking ahead to bank earnings and getting his view on what's going to happen with credit cards. That conversation up next.
The markets, I think, have correctly, gravitated to the positive fundamentals, which is a disinflationary boom that's taking place in the economy. And I think the markets, until there's such time as there actually is real, fire where there's smoke, will continue to do so.
Just another snoozy Monday morning in America. That was Russ Brownback of BlackRock. Equity futures right now in the S&P 500 negative by 0.5%. We're down by 0.8% of the Nasdaq. Wouldn't have it any other way, would you, Bramo? This kind of news flow to start the year?
Are you kidding? No, I would have it a different way. I mean, let's have enough things that we can actually focus on rather than just sort of whack-a-mole.
So, subpoena on Jay Powell, 10% cap on credit card interest rates, ban institutional purchase of single-family homes, directing the FHFA to buy $200 billion more of mortgage-backed securities, increasing the defense budget to $1.5 trillion, but also limit defense contractors to have stock buybacks and dividends, pushing for $2,000 stimulus checks, capping Nicolas Maduro, quote, will help Iran, and aiming for $50 a barrel on WTI.
If you're in the news business, you're long volatility. In the bond market right now, not much volatility, which I think is kind of the story. We are not breaking out of this trading range, at least we haven't this morning. 10 still sub 420. Yields only up by 2 basis points.
Yeah, if you shine enough bright lights in your eyes stop seeing, and that's kind of how it feels.
Bramo. Is that a take on a bond market this morning?
It's put.
Hey?
Well, I just feel like if there are enough shiny things at every given time, I mean, ultimately, what do you focus on? You focus on nothing. You go back to the same things you focus on, and you become a bit numb. And it feels like a little bit that's what's happening right now.
Desensitized in many ways. Counting you down to the opening bell. Lots to look ahead to. Lots of bright lights being shone in your face. Today, the G7 finance ministers meeting kicking off in Washington, plus Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth will be speaking. Look out for that. Tomorrow, CPI data, the president speaking in Detroit, and earnings season begins with JP Morgan and Delta. Wednesday, the US, Greenland and Denmark reportedly holding talks. Supreme Court announces another round of opinions, plus earnings from Bank of America, Wells Fargo and Citi. And then on to Thursday, another round of claims and more bank earnings too. Let's turn to the bank. Shares of credit card providers lower after President Trump demanded lenders cap interest rates at 10% in a move that targets one of their most lucrative sources of capital. Joining us now is David George, senior bank analyst at Baird. David, now I thought we'd be talking about the earnings exclusively, but we have to talk about that now too. Is this just a political stunt, or is this a real policy issue?
Yeah, it's always, good morning, John. It's always dangerous, particularly for me, to wade into the political realm. But from my perspective, it's a political ploy that is going to get very little traction. And as I said in the note that I shot over to you a moment ago, unfortunately, if something like this were to take hold, it would actually hurt the constituency that I think the president's trying to help. If you start to dictate economics in the financial services business, this would lead to less credit availability for the low-end consumer, which would just exacerbate the decay that your prior guest was discussing.
David, how much do you take seriously some of the targeting of banks on both sides of the aisle in the United States in terms of trying to either, maybe not through regulation, but through caps or other methods, try to limit profitability? How much does that complicate earnings that are expected to be widely pretty awesome?
Yeah, the earnings, as you said, Lisa, should be pretty good. Ironically, this administration has actually been fairly bank friendly. as it relates to regulatory reform, which has been a positive, as it relates to the timing of M&A deals getting done. Under the prior administration, it would have taken 12 to 18 months for a bank deal to get done. And now you're seeing deals with the likes of the banks that Huntington has bought and Fifth Third Comerica is going to get done in just 3-4 months. So that's actually been good. And again, I think this is a very low likelihood of occurring or happening. And the stock weakness is, one of these situations where overvaluation meets risk aversion. And when you see those forces collide, you tend to get some weakness. And these stocks have been very, very strong. So some weakness here is not surprising and may give us an opportunity to the extent that it's meaningful.
Well, David, it goes to the question of how much is multiple expansion reaching the end of its limits for some of these banks? In other words, can they truly be growth stocks and move away from being utilities that they were thought of in the regulatory overhang of the post-financial crisis era?
Yeah, anytime someone tells me that these are growth stocks, it's usually a sell indicator, Lisa, from my perspective. These banks are very good businesses through the cycle. Their ROEs are actually very stable. Both credit card companies and banks through the cycle actually generate very respectable ROEs, and we expect that to continue. But to give you some framework, the bank index last year was up 30%. And revenues or pre-provision earnings was up, I'd say 6.5% to 7%. So you can kind of do the math to get the sense as to how much of that is multiple expansion. And from our perspective, the stocks are a little overheated here going into earnings season. It's the highest bar that I can think of since 2021. So we're of the view that you could get a sell the news event in what is going to be, we think, a pretty good quarter, actually one of the best quarters we've seen in some time. But again, expectations are super high going in.
David, always good to see you. Thank you, sir. Thanks for making time for us. David George of Baird, going into bank earnings and reflecting on some of the policy proposals coming out of the White House. This from JP Morgan just moments ago. Not expecting any cuts now for 2026 from this Federal Reserve.
Not expecting any cuts, and they talk about a market unwilling to price out labor market weakness and attention occupied by the Fed chair race. Additional front-end premium may persist for a few months, and that's what we've been focused on the entire morning. How much of this is almost a crisis of its own making for the administration? Because this president wants to see lower interest rates.
I don't know. I have to think that ultimately a lot of people in the Fed seat are looking at this and just trying to judge the data, question of the data. I'm honestly,
Lisa,
I'm just distracted.
I hate to break it
feels
to you.
like you.
January 12th. Okay? Just only the second week.
Feels like a decade.
January 12th.
No, I mean, I like the earnings. I'm excited for those.
Good.
I'm excited
Lisa
for the data. It'll be great.
Lisa might be back tomorrow. Or she might retire. Find out.